It's become one of my favorite New Year's traditions to count down the top 10 car stories of the prior year and ring in the new year at midnight Eastern Time. Of course, I appreciate that so many of you are watching from different time zones and around the globe, but we're here in Atlanta and that seemed like the best way to do it. So I'll be available in the chat or in the comments after the video releases. So thank you so much for your support throughout the year, for supporting us, for supporting our storytellers, and especially for supporting our sponsors. And today's video is sponsored by Glossit, and we've still got them running their best ever DIY ceramic coating offer. For just $69.99, you get a $200 value of their graphene ceramic coating and their ceramic detail spray. It's an amazing product. I use it on all my cars, and I know that you'll love it. But right now, I hope that you love our top 10 car stories of 2022.
This thing obviously had a very checkered history, had no paperwork with it. It was probably the most neglected F40 in the world. Now, it's no secret that my channel being a Ferrari predominant channel, my favorite car, my all-time favorite is the Ferrari F40. One of my biggest regrets was about 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to actually buy one. It was in Belgium, it was about 280,000 euros, which transpired to about 200,000 British pounds. And it was just in my reach. I could have done it. I just sold a 430 Scuderia, needed to borrow a little bit more money, but I could have got and attained my lifetime dream. However, things didn't quite work out. I missed the car, and subsequently, within 6 months, these cars had doubled again, and it wasn't long before they were worth £1 million. And so in mid-2020, when the whole world had just gone into lockdown, everyone was stuck at home, I received an email with a picture of a Ferrari F40 covered in dust, parked in a service station in Iraq. Naturally, it got my juices flowing, and Ratarossa decided he was going to go and find this hidden F40 lost in the desert in Iraq. So my intention at the time was really to try and get this F40, get it out of the country and get it at a reasonable price, maybe somewhere around the original price I was going to buy this F40 for, about £200,000. Obviously, it was a pipe dream at the time, but I thought we're going to try and see if we can actually find this thing. So I did a bit of research on the web, and this picture, I had actually seen it a few years before. Having a little search, I discovered a few more images. From those, I was able to create a video on the channel, and it was really put out there to get everybody to try and help me. Like I say, everyone was sat at home bored, the whole world was just doing nothing. And so this car treasure hunt video basically that I did went viral. It had websites, newspapers. I had the Wall Street Journal come through asking me questions on this hidden Ferrari. I had YouTubers commenting on it. I had Salamandre put $1,000 reward for anybody who could help me find this F40. My channel at the time was relatively small, so it just blew up within a week. So at the time, the whole world, like I say, was in lockdown. We were all quite bored. So this amazing one-off car that was hidden away, this fantastic car treasure, probably one of the most exciting ones in the world, got everybody involved. It went everywhere around the world. Australia, I was getting so many. I didn't sleep for a week because I was just bombarded with emails. I had so many comments on the video, which made me subsequently really want to find this car and try and save it even more. And then I had people commenting, telling me, sending me pictures, sending me videos of this F40 actually in Iraq. So it was a really crazy, bizarre week at the time. Most people love shiny, brand new ones. Me, however, the thing that floats my boat is finding those diamonds in the rough, the ones that have a lot of potential, the ones that I can see through and see with a bit of elbow grease how good these can be. I've done it with the Ratarossa, I'm doing it with the BBI. Ferraris in particular are my thing, but the ultimate for me is the Ferrari F40. So when this amazing picture turned up in my email of a neglected Ferrari covered in dust, sat on the side of the road. Rattarossa was on the case. Within a week, we'd actually tracked down the whereabouts of this car. We used certain information. So, like I say, from the pictures, we were able to see that it was parked in a service station in Iraq. We could see in the background, and we were able to nail down the location. And from that, people were able to tell me and say that it'd been shipped to various other places. We had pictures of the car, and it looked in a terrible state, literally sand everywhere. We had the rear clam open, you could see the engine, it had sand all over this car. It looked horrendous. The paintwork was really faded. All the Lexan rear polycarbonate screens just scratched, you couldn't see through them. It had a horrendous steering wheel on it, looked like it came from Halford's car showroom, and it was still something that I thought, well, on my channel, it'll be great to try and rebuild and get this car. So part of that week, during that week, I had a rather strange email that came through. It says, hi, I'm Big Chris from Gas Monkey Garage, and gave me some information to prove it was all real, and said, I can help you out with this Ferrari F40. I know where it is. I've actually been there, and we tried to buy it. Gas Monkey, obviously, being my absolute favorite. I watched the black F40 probably about 10 times that series on Gas Monkey. So basically, they finished the black one. They had a load of parts left over, and they also knew about this F40 in Iraq. Big Chris had flown out there, got himself into the country. They had also tried to buy this car and got very close. It was going to take quite an effort to get it out of the country. And he came on the channel. We talked about how we could do it. And well, unfortunately, we didn't manage to get anywhere with it, but we tracked down this car. So the car had moved from this service station. It had gone somewhere else. During its time, it had then had a specialist flown in from Europe. It was a Ferrari F40 owned by Saddam Hussein's son, Udi. Being royalty, they were the only ones allowed to drive these cars. So there was no Ferrari garages, no Ferrari techs over in Iraq. A specialist had to be flown over there, and he worked on this car, managed to get it actually running, and then the trail stopped. So during the Iraq War, it was famously known that during the invasion, all of Saddam Hussein's sons, he was a car collector, all of them got abandoned. Some of them apparently got buried in the desert, and this F40 luckily didn't get buried, but it was just abandoned on the side of the road in this petrol station. Over the course of the week, we managed to find out a few more bits of information, and I even had guys over there in the town of Erbil, where this car was located, who said, I know where this car is. They got some video footage of me of where it currently was located. This car was driving around this interesting character's house. Let's just leave it there at that. And the car sounded absolutely horrendous. You could hear it. It was misfiring. It had been painted. It looked okay on the outside, but it certainly was not running very well at all. Udi, apparently, when he had this car, the story goes that each morning, if he ever wanted to use it, whatever clothes he was wearing, he would have the car repainted to match his outfit. So it had multiple coats of paint, this car. And so it was far from its original, where you can see the carbon weave through that thin layer of Rosso Corsa paint. So anyway, we had this car, we'd located it. Big Chris, Gas Monkey, had tried to buy the car, had tried to get it out. They had everything lined up to do that, but certain things happened and it never materialized. But the guy who currently owned the car in Erbil caught wind of the story and was prepared to sell it, which sounded great. We were very excited about that until we heard the amount of money he wanted for it, which ended up being 1.3 million. I think it was dollars, or it might have been pounds at the time, which was actually more money than a decent Ferrari F40 with great history. This thing obviously had a very checkered history, had no paperwork with it, was probably the most neglected F40 in the world. So at 1.2 million, that F40 in particular was definitely off the table for me. And also at the same time, it was a very, very sketchy car. In the background, I was getting emails from a lot of people in Iraq who believed that the car really should stay there. And to top it all off, on Twitter, Saddam Hussein's daughter put a message out saying that anyone who tries to take that car out of Iraq would face consequences. So the downside of obviously putting a story like this out in the general public on YouTube and it going viral means that even if I could afford the car, the chances are it would have gone up for auction and I would have been outbid anyway. So that car for me was a no-go. I have subsequently had several people who have asked me if I want to buy it. They know the car. Apparently it's somehow come out of Iraq, but knowing the history and knowing what came with putting the videos out, I definitely would not want to buy that car either way, even if it was pretty cheap. So on the channel, I have decided in the future, we will be building an F40, so watch this space.
We'd like to thank Glossit for supporting the VinWiki channel this month, and right now Glossit is offering the best DIY ceramic coating package that we've ever seen or certainly offered here on VinWiki. For just $69.99, you're going to get their graphene ceramic coating along with the Real Difference Maker, their ceramic detail spray. Now that's a $50 bottle of spray detailer that I truly love just for daily use, but when you use that alongside their graphene ceramic coating, it makes the removal a lot easier, the outcome a lot smoother, you avoid high spots and things like that. So a DIY idiot like me in my own garage can achieve an outcome pretty similar to what Rich and his team were able to do last year on the Paris Hilton SLR, which I eventually torture tested on rallies and road trips and all this stuff, and it is now in Bulgaria, still looking wonderful. So check it out now at the link in the description below. There's a very limited quantity, so respond now and get yours for just $69.99. Thanks, Glossit.
And it was like kind of like they put all the engineers in a room and they've been having all these crazy ideas and they let them loose and they're like, boom, 959. One of the cars I am most fortunate to have been around, and quite a few of them, was the Porsche 959. And I have touched and seen probably more than some of these guys who worked at the factory. The numbers are rough, even for Porsche. They're not quite sure how many were made. I count them at 329, including all the prototypes. Some people say a couple more, but they were never officially brought into the US, so there's only even fewer here that have been brought in since. But I want to talk about the car and a lot of the myths that stand around it, because it is one of the most legendary supercars ever created. It was Porsche's first supercar, and over the years, some really strange stories have been told about it. Just to give you some background on the 959. The 959 was a project started in the early 80s. This was a time when it was thought that the 911 was going to go away, and that all the new front-engine transaxle cars were going to be the wave of the future. The 928 and the 924 and the 944 were moving along. And Porsche had people on the inside who wanted none of that, that the 911 was going to continue growing and being what it was. At the same time, there was a change in the rules with the FIA for race cars. And the rules stipulated they were going to change the categories from Group 4, 5, and 6. Group 5 was like the 935, 800 horsepower turbo cars that were dominant, like at the 79 Le Mans. Group 6 would be like the Porsche 936 prototypes. And they were going to change that to A, B, and C. And who knows why? I mean, these guys change stuff all the time just to screw with fans, I think, and the teams. But A was going to be cars that they had to build 5,000 of them in a 12-month period to homologate them. And homologation is essentially, you have to build enough cars to prove that it's a production car, and they have different levels of it. Group B came along, and it had to be 200 cars built in a 12-month period. And Group C was going to be the prototypes, which means it didn't have to be based on anything. And those would be the cars like the 956, the 962, and the Jaguars, and all the really cool race cars that were at Le Mans in the 80s. There was going to be a Group B road racing series as well. And 2 cars were built for that. It never happened. One was the Porsche 959, and the other one was the Ferrari 288 GTO. And the 288 GTO was basically a homologation version of the 308, except they took the engine, they turned it a different direction, they put on some intercoolers and some turbos, they lengthened it a little bit, and it's really one of the most beautiful cars from the 80s. But it was designed to be a foil to the 959. The 959's original name internally was the Group B. And what's interesting, it wasn't originally supposed to be 911 based. There's some stories inside where they were going to build the Group B out of a 914 center tub and then put on the prototype front and rear ends and put in the 2.1 liter from the Moby Dick car and make this insane machine. That was a little too out there because they had to build, of course, 200 of these things. So it was decided that it would be 911 based. Now, the 959 wasn't built to be a rally car. That is what you read in every single article and on every single thing you watch on the internet. They're like, it was built to be a rally car. It was built to be a homologation car for Group B because Porsche's clients, their racing clients, 80% of the clients were road racing clients. 20% of the clients were rally clients. Who are you going to build for? Where are you going to sell things? Where are you going to make the money? They knew coming out that they were behind the ball because the design didn't start and the idea of the Group B didn't start until 1981. They weren't going to be able to get that car done for years. And the Audi Quattro was already on its way. Lancia's days were over. Audi Quattro, 4-wheel drive was the future. So the feature was that they were going to take the 911 and make it the most advanced car. They were going to make it their showcase car for every technology you could ever think of. The 288 GTO is a tractor compared to a 959, what eventually came out. It's basically using the engine from the 956 race car. It's the same idea. It's a 2.85 liter twin turbo, sequential twin turbo, which was very interesting. The idea was to take a smaller turbo and a bigger turbo. The little one would feed off the line so you wouldn't have as much turbo lag, and then the second one would kick in. It isn't like a modern car. It still had turbo lag, but it was a lot less than before. So it was a twin turbo engine. It had water-cooled heads, which for a Porsche was like, everything's got to be air-cooled, but it was water-cooled, 4-valve heads on it, center lock wheels on them. The wheels themselves had hollow spokes. They were made out of magnesium. It was the first tire pressure monitoring system for a street car because if a hub cracked, you'd want to know if it was losing air. The tires on them were special tires made originally by Dunlop and then by Bridgestone. And they had the locking feature would lock them to the rim. So they were technically run-flat tires. There was no spare in 959. So you had special tires, special wheels, center lock like a racing car. And you didn't have to worry about them getting stolen because you had to use the drive key to unlock the hub. And then it was like 625 foot-pounds of torque to put the wheels on. So for 959 wheels are totally safe. The only part of a 911 that was really left in looks was the roof line, the windows, and the doors. But the doors were aluminum, the hoods were aluminum, the roof was Kevlar, as was the fenders. You can take, and I've seen this because I was there, you can take a 959 fender and bend it, and it will snap right back to the shape it was. The technology was all space-age stuff. This is the day of the space shuttle. It was the space shuttle of cars. It had adjustable suspension. It was really interesting because they had coilovers and a hydraulic, so they kind of work against each other. In the early cars, the comforts. So the early cars were the comforts. Later on would be the sports. The comforts had the ability to raise the car 2 different levels, which again lent to the whole idea that it was a rally car and you're going to jack the car up. It had a 6-speed transmission. The 6-speed transmission was interesting. It's one of the first in any street car. The first gear wasn't labeled 1. It was labeled G, for like Glund, which is like terrain or off-road or country. And the idea was, well, that's the granny gear to kind of get you out. And then they had 5 other gears. It was technically 6 forward speeds. It's not a granny gear. G's not for granny. So it's the same ratio as the first gear in like a 964. It'll take you to 35 miles an hour. The reason for that is that European sound laws were such that starting it in second gear made it quieter when it rolled away. So they got around something with that little trick. It had 4-wheel drive and a really advanced 4-wheel drive system that was only used in the 959. And it used like the torque tunnel idea that the 928 had. They used a lot. The 959 was a culmination of, decades of their engineering. And it was like kind of like they put all the engineers in a room and they've been having all these crazy ideas and they let them loose. And they're like, boom, 959. When it came out, and when people found out about it, they lost their minds. Like, it looked like a kind of strange melted 911, but there was still 911 there. And the claims were off the charts. It was 450 horsepower, which in the 80s was a whole lot. The car is not that heavy. And then, 4-wheel drive, capable of, in the original comfort form, of 197 miles an hour out of the box. It was the fastest car at that time. That was the fastest car you could buy. It was just magnificent and misunderstood because who's ever seen one? Who's ever driven one? Now, time comes for production to actually sell the damn cars. They have to make 200 of these things. So production starts, prototypes and things start in 85, 86, the cars start getting underway. The cars are usually titled as 87 and 88s. You'll see that it is never, so that's it. That's the production run. And what happened was they were going to sell cars all over the world. In the United States, they were going to sell in Europe. And the car started getting tremendously expensive, as you would guess, from all the features and crazy custom stuff in it. And they were handmade cars. Originally, the guess was $60,000. Then it was $120,000. Then it was $240,000. In the 80s, that is a ton of money. Then the Deutschmark flipped on the dollar, and the Deutschmark's getting hammered. Suddenly, selling the cars in the United States, which they're already losing money on, is just financially detrimental to the corporation. They need an out. What happened was, and this is why you never saw one back in the day, the claim was that they never crash tested them, or they failed crash testing, or they never presented a car to the United States to crash test. The United States government has never in its history crash tested a car. The manufacturers are responsible for crash testing the car at a certified facility and then presenting the DOT with the results. Porsche, in their contract, had a little clause that said that if the car did not meet DOT, that their contracts in the United States were null and void. Well, guess what happened? They were null and void. Now, this began a war, a small little war between Porsche and the US government, because Porsche was pointing the finger at the DOT and saying, oh, they won't let your car in the country. Sorry about that. And DOT's like, you never gave us anything. How are we supposed to bring it in? Now, the 959 passed all the TÜV and everything in Europe. It is a crash-tested car. That car is solid. I mean, would you want to crash into a wall in a 959 or your Dodge Colt? You make a choice. So it was fully capable of passing it. It was just they wanted to get out of contracts. Now, who were you selling 959s to in the United States back in the day for that kind of money? Really rich dudes. And guess who you just pissed off? A lot of really rich dudes. And they're knocking on the doors of their congressmen going, why can't I get my car? And the DOT's taking the heat, and the Porsche lawyers are like, he. We did it. We pulled it off. So there were no 959s sold new in the United States. Interestingly enough, there were no 288 GTOs sold in the United States either, the other Group B car. They were never officially federalized and imported in the US. Now you got a lot of pissed off rich white guys down here in America wanting their 959s, and the Europeans are like, I got mine, woohoo, and they're driving them. So there begins a movement of people to get them into the United States. How do we get our 959s into the US? Al Holbert, who was running Porsche Motorsports for North America, he's like, we can bring in some 959s as race cars, track day cars. And the 959S was born. Although there is records of European 959Ss before the American ones, the 29 American ones that were built, never brought to America, but were built. And those 959Ss were kind of the prototypes for the US ones, because what had happened in the meantime, it took so long to get the 959 to market, the 288 GTO was no longer the top dog at Ferrari. The F40 was. The F40 came along and went 199 miles an hour. Unseated the 959. Remember, they still got to sell these cars. They've got to be the fastest car. So there were some specially made 959s, the S's, that had a top speed of 214 miles an hour. And they were the first production car, technically, to crack 200 miles an hour. Some people say it was the F40, really the 959. Al Holbert goes 959S. What we're going to do, we're going to totally fool the US government. We're going to put a roll cage in it, a roll cage wrapped in leather. It is a luxury car. We take out the back seat, take out the stereo, thin out some of the sound insulation. They took out the adjustable suspension, which was a great thing for the car. Just put in coilovers in all four corners. They started basically stripping it down to make it a lighter, faster car. Air conditioning went. They took off the right side rearview mirror. So the 959S, he brings them into the US and gets a few of them to his shop. And DOT's like, what you got there? And Dick Merritt was the man at the DOT. And he's a legend. Like, if you wanted to get a car in the US, there's no huge department. You go through him. He's the guy who says yes or no. He was probably the only car guy in the entire department. Like, the only guy who actually knew one car from another. Like, yep, that's your job. And he was a real car guy. Merritt's like, what you got there? It's still got street tires on it. Like, is this a track day car? So they go out to Nazareth Raceway, which is not too far from Holbert's place, to drive a 959S. And I guess it took all of like a few laps and a minute. And he's like, this isn't a race car. This isn't a track car. Out. And off the 959Ss went back to Europe. So we didn't get the 959Ss either. Now people are doubly disappointed. Bruce Canepa got a few in, had them at his shop, but he couldn't drive them. He couldn't drive them on the road. But he had plans for them. He had plans to develop them over the 90s. Because Porsche was shutting down production, he could do something with them later. Maybe he could be the guy who takes them to the next level. And he becomes the 959 guy, the go-to 959 guy. So here's the conundrum. You're one of these rich guys who desires a 959. How do you get it into the United States? Well, Bruce Canepa, Bill Gates, Paul Allen, Otis Chandler, all these guys who were really into the car, got together and they hired a lawyer and got themselves into US politics. They went to petition and create a law, essentially, to allow these special cars into the US. And that law eventually would be called the Show or Display Law. I think the effort began in 1991. And this is how our government works. They put it into a bill and the bill would fail. They put it into another bill and the bill would fail. Eventually, they put it into a transportation bill that was going to pass in 1998. And it was a rider in the bill. And it passed. So as of 1998, this Show or Display Law allowed special vehicles into the US. They had to have 500 or less of them be made. There were some special stipulations of what it could be. Had to be of some special significance. But it was the 959 and its fans that created that law. That law, interestingly enough, opened the door for the McLaren F1, the Jaguar XJ220, the Bugatti EB110. So all these untouchable cars suddenly became touchable and they came into the US. Now, remember, this is just getting them into the United States. They still had to be smogged and licensed in the respective states. So in California, as you might guess, No. But Bruce Canepa had been working and developing on these cars, working with Porsche, working with his own engineers, and came up with his Generation 1 car, and essentially kind of seeing what the 959 would have become. So he used a lot of technology from the 993 and new fuel mapping and wiring harnesses and things like that. And he actually got quite a few 959s California smog legal. I think there were like 22 of them. And that's significant because getting anything through California's smog laws is an impressive feat. And he would eventually build the Gen 2 car and the Gen 3 car. And now he's building the 959 SC, which when I was working there, he was developing that car. And it is staggering. It shows you what the 959, a 1980s car, could have become. And they're working on the platform built in 1987, 1988. The car's making, on pump gas, 800 horsepower. The 0 to 60 times are in hypercar territory. They're in the low twos. And this is a car you have to manually shift. It's no flappy paddle, no launch control. It is bonkers. It would have been fascinating. It's just one of those untold stories that would never happen of what the 959 could have become. It was the first Porsche supercar. Then came the Carrera GT, then the 918. Well, this 959 that Bruce built is as fast as a 918. It's crazy. But it was sad that we didn't get to see that car become something, that car was pretty much stillborn. Thankfully, they survived the financial ruin that car could have cost them. Today, the 959 is a legend. And it's a legend not just for the car it is, but the stories that surround it. And it wouldn't be the ultimate Radwood car if it weren't for all the great machinations and moves around it and all the weird myths that have been created around it. It is the most significant, in my mind, Porsche ever built, and probably one of the greatest sports cars ever.
5 years ago, the first sponsor we ever had here on the VinWiki channel was Caffeine and Octane. Now, they're our local Atlanta Cars and Coffee meetup that I've been going to for 15 or so years now, but it is now the largest monthly recurring automotive gathering on Earth. Now, you'll also recognize Caffeine and Octane from their television show, and the next season of that airs very soon on Motor Trend. In their quest for further automotive world domination, they just bought the legendary Lanier Motor Speedway, which is across the street from Road Atlanta. So throughout the next year, we're going to have a lot of amazing events there that you'll be invited to join. But the coolest project they've deployed lately is called HighOctane.tv, and it's a free streaming network that you can access from any smart TV, Roku, Fire Stick, smartphone, or a computer, and it'll give you access to a ton of programming, including all 5 seasons of their show, some content from creators we love like David Patterson, That Dude in Blue, and a ton more. Soon there will be some content from VinWiki on there as well. So visit the link in the description below to learn more about the amazing world of Caffeine and Octane.
I'm getting phone calls. It was on a Wednesday night, and I thought something happened to a family member. I mean, they're blowing me up. So nonetheless, my middle brother, Chris, he had called and was like, Chad, we found Dad's car. And I mean, the sheer excitement that was going on. And I was like, all right, calm down, give me the information. I want to know exactly who, what, where, when, why, how. Ultimately, for me, for all of us, cars are incredibly impactful in our lives, right? I think that's pretty easy as a car guy, something that we learn pretty quick in life. So for me, a car that was incredibly impactful was my father's 69 Shelby, small block car, so 350. Ultimately, growing up, I'd spent a lot of time in the garage. I kind of considered myself daddy's boy for the most part. Forgive me, I do have 2 brothers, Chris and Brandon. But ultimately, whether it was car shows, detailing the vehicle, working on it, the impact that it had on me was pretty profound because it really directed where I went with my life as far as my career. Because I've been a big car guy. I'm in the auto industry in a multitude of roles at this point. It all stems really from that car. So my father had the car, I think he bought it, I want to say November of 75. So obviously that was going to be a little bit before I was born. And he had the vehicle for 39 years. So the impact that it had on us is ultimately, it really became a sister to us. At some point, I want to say I moved down here to the Atlanta area in November of 2000. Us being from Cherry Valley, Illinois, population about 2,000. Moving down here, anytime I talked to my father, that was always a question that was asked, hey, how's a Shelby doing? You catch up on your day-to-day stuff and hey, how's the car? My father had sold the car in 2014 and kind of lied to us about it in essence. Ultimately the conversations, again, hey, how's it going? Have you had the Shelby out? Any car shows? What's been going on? It's fine, Chad. It's sitting in storage. So nonetheless, didn't really think a whole lot of it until one day in August of 2014. I do remember getting a call from my dad because I had a couple friends over. We were on the back patio. I'll never forget it. And ultimately, my dad was just like, Chad, I did something. I sold the Shelby. So after probably what seemed like 20 minutes of just sheer silence as I'm trying to process, the information that he's given me, I was, asking questions. Hey, who'd you sell it to? When'd you sell it? All of that. And at the time, he wasn't really forthcoming with that information. Hey, I sold it to a Shelby broker out of Indiana. And then I started asking when. Oh, it was a few months ago. So with the impact that this car had on our life, it was pretty upsetting, to say the least. It's, again, that sounds silly, but like people, cars are impactful. I know I've said that a few times. And, at this time, I'd spent a long time really just on the internet, not making a full court press to find it, but, it was important to me. I wanted to find out where the car was because growing up, I always found or felt like that was going to be my car one way or the other, whether I purchased it from, the family, however the case may be, it didn't matter. I just had it in my mind at a young age that was my car. As time goes on, ultimately, I think if I have my numbers right based on the Deluxe Marty, I think they made 7 Royal Maroon white interior 4-speed small block cars for that year. So the chances are if you find one, there's a good chance that could be it. So throughout all this time, could never find the car. And I can remember chatting with my youngest brother, Brandon, and just kind of talking to him about, hey, you know what? I either want to get a Shelby or a GT3. I know they're polar opposite vehicles, but that's really where my heart was. So after a little bit of chatting, I think which way we went. Was like, hey, you know what? Let's make a true full court press and let's find, Dad's old car. If you're going to get a Shelby, this is the only way to do it. And I, of course, agreed. So we spent a long time, really looking into a multitude of ways of trying to find the car and could never find it. And again, my 2 brothers are up in Northern Illinois, me being down here, we're going different avenues to try to find and locate the car. A couple days later, I'm getting phone calls. It was on a Wednesday night, and I thought something happened to a family member. I mean, they're blowing me up. So nonetheless, my middle brother, Chris, he had called and was like, Chad, we found Dad's car. And I mean, the sheer excitement that was going on. And I was like, all right, calm down, give me the information. I want to know exactly who, what, where, when, why, how. And lo and behold, they're sending me this information. It ended up being a third-party video at basically a restoration shop out in Arizona. And as they're, doing the full video of the car, obviously they're going to pull up the VIN plate, thankfully. At this time, I kind of left out, I'd remember what the VIN was. It was the last 4 digits. We'd happen to recall what those were, so it was going to be pretty easy to figure it out. With all that excitement, my youngest brother, Brandon, at this point, he's like, listen, I'm going to call that shop and see if we can get any information. So, and thankfully, even with all the privacy laws, this said shop was kind enough to provide the owner's email address, right? So this video that we found was from 2017. We're currently February 2020. And at this point, we get the email address the next day. And I just tell my brothers, I said, I got it from here. So as soon as I get to the office, the first thing I'm doing is I'm emailing this gentleman. I probably sat there for 30 minutes typing up a multitude of emails. And finally, as I'm deleting these, I settle on a very basic 3-sentence email that I fired off to him. Ultimately knowing that the car was out in Arizona at this point, I've got my phone sitting to my right, and I'm just waiting and praying that I get a phone call or a response via email, whatever the case may be. It was about 4 hours after I'd sent the email, I'd received a phone call inbound from Arizona. So as soon as I saw it was Arizona, I was getting pretty excited. So I had to keep my calm, my composure there, and answer the phone professionally because, again, I was at work. And within about 45 seconds, I pretty much was pouring my heart out to this guy because I was very excited. I just recall going, Mitch, I really appreciate the call. Tell me about the car. How did you acquire it? And he was just a gentleman about it. And he was just like, Chad, he's like, how do you know I have this car? And at that point, that's when just my heart started pouring it out to him and go, listen, hey, I've been looking for this car since 2014. It was my father's car. It was in the family for 39 years. And as he pauses and takes all that in, he starts asking me some basic questions. I was like, listen, I'll tell you anything about that car. I know there's certain details I can give you. So as we continue and start our conversation, he starts to tell me some of the basics that he's done to the car. Obviously, at this point, based on the third-party video that we found, we knew that it went through a restoration. And I was like, listen, I'm going to make this real easy. You obviously had the car all apart. Well, there is a particular area of the vehicle that was damaged that you would never know about unless you pull it apart. So ultimately, if you have the front fenders off the vehicle, there's this bulbous structure component of the vehicle that was dented in. So I proceeded to tell him, I said, listen, I could tell you where there is a dent that you would never know about it unless you had the front clip off the car. And ultimately, I want to say in December of 75, so shortly after my father bought it, him and his buddy Butch stuck it through a fence there in Belvidere, Illinois. So I knew about that. And at that point in time, he was blown away because they remember looking at that, trying to figure out what had happened. So nonetheless, as we spend, 45 minutes chatting like a couple of 16-year-old schoolgirls, we're winding down the conversation. He goes, Chad, I feel guilty I even own this car. I have no intentions of selling it. I spent a long time looking for it. And I understood. And he's like, just make me an offer. And I go, Mitch, the reality is based on everything that you've done to this car, it's unfortunately going to be out of my means. So as we continue to wind down, he goes, you know what, Chad? He goes, if you and your brothers ever want to come out and see the car, you're welcome to come out. I go, Mitch, you do not know who you're talking to. I said, the timing of this is perfect. Ironically, this is a couple days before I have vacation. So as I get off the phone with him, I call my brothers, and they both, Chris and Brandon, both say the same thing. When are we going? So nonetheless, this was a Thursday that I speak with Mitch. By Wednesday of next week, all three of us were in Scottsdale, Arizona to see the car, which was fantastic. As we take our journey, out to Scottsdale, we get there, again, just an absolute gentleman as far as, how he treated us, so respectful. And I think ultimately for him, again, because cars are so impactful, he kind of had a story about a car. So he felt, it really pulled at his heartstrings too. So he really obliged. He actually had the car staged for us in his large garage. And now we've got waterworks flying, right? He was great because, it's not many guys that are going to want to throw you keys for their car, right? So he's trying to throw us the keys to the car, and I just remember looking at him, with the emotions that are going through all three of us. I was like, Mitch, I really just want to go for a ride. That's all I want to do. And lo and behold, he obliged. He took us all for a ride, and it was fantastic. By the time we finished up, this was a kamikaze trip, so it was a one-day deal. And ultimately, he finally threw a number at me that, again, was beyond my means. But we had such a great conversation. I was like, listen, if there's ever a time that, you're going to market the car, please, make sure I get the first right of refusal. So we leave. It was great. We loved it. We'd stayed in touch. So at this time, we were there in February as COVID's hitting. And then 2 months later, I'd reached out to him just to kind of touch base. Just to make sure he understood, hey, I want this car. I think about it every day. That's how bad I want this machine. We probably spent about an hour on the phone, and he'd actually was working with me on the price, which I really appreciated. And again, after this conversation, it was still beyond my financial means. I had a number that I felt that I could make happen, right? So we finished this conversation up, and I immediately called my brothers because once this conversation ended, I kind of felt like that was the finality of, any type of negotiations with pricing. And so I called my brothers, and I'm emotionally upset at this point, calling them to tell them that, hey, unfortunately, I just don't think I can make this happen. Both of my brothers understood, Chris and Brandon, not that we were happy about it, but we understood. So, as I'm chatting with them, I said, guys, if another one ever comes available, my only option may be just to wait to find a similar car, another Royal Maroon white interior 4-speed car. Again, I want to say based on Deluxe Marty, there was about 7 of them made. So I'd emotionally at that point made up my mind that, hey, when I see one and find one, it's a wrap. It's going to be in my garage. I'm just sitting there thinking as I'm having a conversation with my brothers and my wife, who has also been amazingly supportive, and you'll find out why here in a moment. I just emotionally was like, I'm buying it as soon as we see one. And after all this time I'd been looking, I'd never really come across a small block car. You see a lot of the big block cars and automatics, but I was pretty specific about what I wanted. And I'm telling you, it was probably about 6 or 7 days later after I had emotionally decided that, hey, if another Royal Maroon manual car comes available, like it's going to be mine. So nonetheless, one became available down in Florida by happenstance. Again, every day we're thumbing, right? We're car guys. We're thumbing, we're looking for cars. And I about died when I saw the exact same car, Royal Maroon, white interior, 4-speed. I remember going running to my wife. I go, well, apparently I do something with my voice and how I talk to her. She knows it's car related. And the question is, what's it going to cost us? So I show her, she's like, oh Lord, here we go. So I said, hey, listen, if this is a rust-free car, it's a wrap. Like, I'm buying it. So the crazy thing was I couldn't get off work to go do it. So my brother Brandon was kind enough to fly down and kind of be my hands and eyes. So he actually, took the time to fly down to Orlando to check this car out. And lo and behold, he gets down there. We got it on the rack. We're checking out rust-free Texas car. Beautiful. I said, it's done. Tell him I want the car. Let's just get this, right? I get the car home. I'm happy as a clam. I legit have a little gathering at the house to kind of celebrate and party that, hey, I've got my Shelby, part of my world's complete, right? This was April of 20. Come August, I get an email from Mitch, and it was a very brief email, and it was just, hey Chad, listen, I'm gonna market the car in a manual where, hey, I feel it's gonna sell, within 30 days. Are you still interested? I was really mixed on how I was emotionally feeling about this. Am I happy? Am I excited? Am I angry? Because again, I have my car, I'm happy, I've already kind of making some small changes to the car, to make it mine, if you will. Right away, I pick up the phone, because what I had done in the meantime is once I bought this other Shelby that looks just like the one that he owns, I had sent him some photos. So come to find out, I pick up the phone, I call him, I said, hey Mitch, absolutely, I appreciate you reaching out to me. Did you not get those photos and text that I had sent you? And he's like, well, yeah, I just thought you were giving me some footage of, when your father owned the car. At that point, I just kind of die laughing because I understand they look exactly the same. And he's like, I'm sorry. He's like, ultimately, had I known you bought one, I probably would have left you alone. And I'm like, no. I said, Mitch, you did the right thing. I was like, listen, let me follow up with you, the next day, because I was actually flying out of town to go see my family up north. And ultimately, him and I connected at the airport. And we chatted again for about another hour as I'm waiting for my flight. And he actually hit me at a number which would have been the absolute tip top of what I was prepared to do when we first connected in February. So at this point, I've got some money already tied up, in one car. And, ultimately I call my wife and I'm like, you are not going to believe who I just heard from. If it wasn't for her and my brothers, I don't know which way I would have gone. To deal with the stress, financially of, maneuvering a couple of cars like that, for me. But she ultimately was just like, Chad, if you feel, we can just make this happen as we sell the other car, you're going to have to do this because I'm never going to hear it for the rest of our lives together. I'm like, well, she's actually right. So, I call him back. I said, listen, I'm going to be out of town for the next 5 days. I'll call you as soon as I get back. And he's like, that's fine, Chad. I'm not going to mark it. I'll wait for you. So lo and behold, I proceed to purchase the car after I was going to tell him no. I went to pick up the phone and call him. And in my head, I was like, I'm just not going to do it. Hey, I've got it. It doesn't make any sense. I picked up the phone, call him. I go, Mitch, I'm going to send you 10 grand. Let me figure out the rest. Just give me a couple of days. So nonetheless, I move forward with the car. So now at this point in time, I'm sitting there with two of the exact same cars, 0404 and 0683. I worked so hard to convince my wife to let me keep them both because I think, you know what, a his and a hers. Who wouldn't want a his and hers? Who wouldn't? I worked about 8 months. When I say 8 months, I think it was legitimate 8 months before it finally had to go away. My wife, as great as she is, she was not letting that happen. But so I ended up selling the other car, and I don't know for sure. I want to say it went out to North Carolina, but so nonetheless, I'm down to one, like a normal human being, I guess. But nonetheless, I tried to get two, but it didn't work. Try to keep two.
We'd like to thank the Ticket Clinic for supporting VinWiki this month. When you get a ticket, no matter where it happens, you're risking points on your license, costly fines, insurance premium increases, and risks of suspension or jail time. So it's more important than ever to have great representation. The Ticket Clinic is a nationwide law firm that can help you fight a ticket no matter where you get it. It's easier than ever to start a relationship with them. You'll just take your ticket, snap a picture of it, and text that picture to 305-305. You can also reach them at the link in the description below to thank them for their support of VinWiki and fight your ticket with the Ticket Clinic.
The dent was from Art's ex-wife. So in Cannonball, expecting the unexpected is always a good philosophy. And that has to do with the running of it and everything else. But sometimes the unexpected happens outside the Cannonball. And that happened to me. I got a phone call from Ed Bolian, which is usually a good thing. Usually good things come from phone calls from him. As he's seen in the video, he owned one of the Audi Cannonball cars, the Brock Yates cars. And he chased that down and got the #1 car and had a modicum of success with it in its running. Mostly troubles with it, I believe. But there were 12 of them made. Nobody knows where any of them are, except for that #1 car. So the phone call comes and Ed goes, I just got a phone call. It's from the owner of number 11. Really? And I'd always said I totally would want one of these in the belief that no one's ever going to find one. You know, they're stuck in a junkyard. They have one sticker on them identifying what it is, and it's probably been stripped away years ago. And he's all, the owner of number 11 called and is looking to sell it. And I obviously already have one. Would you be interested in that? I'm like, yes, I would. I mean, I didn't care if it was a pile of junk. That's kind of one of the holy grails of Cannonball, is this mysterious Audi Quattro from 1985. So he gives me the woman's number, Amy, and I give her a call. And they live up in Washington. I'm like, hi, I'm John Ficarra. Ed Bolian told me about your Audi. And she goes, I know who you are. I'm like, really? Because she had gone online and apparently watched, and did all the Google research on me that I found out I was a cannonballer. That was her stipulation. She wanted to sell the car to a cannonballer. And I apparently had passed the test. And she was as sweet as you could get about it. It was her husband's car, who had just passed away. And he bought it new from Brumos in Georgia in 85 and owned it his entire life. And it was his pride and joy. Apparently, whatever other car came into their lives, the Audi had the garage. It was always inside and taken care of. She's like, are you interested in it? I'm like, yeah, I absolutely. So we came to a fair number. As I do quite often at my house, I go, honey? And my wife, Laura, knows instantly what that means. She's like, what are you buying? Ed Bolian found one of the other Audi Cannonball cars. She's like, you're buying it, aren't you? I'm like, yeah. We worked out a number. I bought the car. My friend Tyler at Rule Garage up in Washington went and looked at it for me and got it. And I thought, great, it's a Cannonball car. I'm going to fly up there. I'm going to cannonball it back to my house in California. Be an appropriate thing to do. And he's like, yeah, maybe not. You know, it's been sitting for a while. He put a battery in it. The tires were a little old. And he's like, you know, this comes with a lot of things. I'm like, what do you mean? And Amy had mentioned it. He had bought some spares for it. He's like, there's a whole other set of wheels. He's like, there's an entire bottom to a 4000 Quattro. I'm like, a bottom? He's like, yeah, the floor pan. It has a dent in the bottom of it from apparently some impact. It turns out Art, who owned the car, was insanely meticulous. He was an architect. In his mind, you just replaced the floor, to make it perfect again. He had bought an extra grill. The grill was fine. Bought an extra grill. He had boxes of stuff. He's like, you probably want to ship this. I'm like, okay. And he goes, and it doesn't go in reverse. I'm like, well, that's concerning, because if reverse is going, there's a chance the other gears are going to follow along. And it is like a 800,000 mile drive down to my house. I'm like, I think I'm going to just err on the side of reason. So I ship it down and it arrives, and it is so cool. I'd only briefly saw Ed's when it was sitting at his house. I never ridden in it. I never really took a close enough interest to know exactly what it was. And it's a 1985 Audi 4000S Quattro. And the story goes that back in the day, in 1985, Brumos, which is a dealership down in Jacksonville, Florida, who's very famous, and if you'd ever look them up, for racing Porsches, Bob Snodgrass, who was the legendary general manager of the place, decided they were going to do the One Lap of America in 1985. Of course, the Cannonball was over at that point. So they built a special Audi 4000S Quattro to do it. And at this point, the One Lap wasn't what it is today. And what it is today is they take cars and you start at the tire rack and you go every day to a different track, and you do 2 sessions in each track, and you accumulate the time at each track, and then you drive overnight to the next track. And it's an extraordinary event, and it's fantastic. But back then, the One Lap, which was Brock Yates' production, because he shut the Cannonball down because he thought somebody was going to die, which probably would have happened. It was literally a lap of the United States. You would start in one corner of the US and drive to the other corner, down the other corner, and then over the corner, and then back up. And you had to match the time that Brock Yates had set, which was a mystery time. Whoever got closest won, is my understanding how it worked. The Audi was pole position for 1985. And Snodgrass and 2 other guys drove the car. And when they got back, Snodgrass, not brilliant marketer, not missing an opportunity, was like, well, what we need to do is build some replicas of my fantastic Audi. And so they did. They built 12. And Brock Yates signed off on it. And the idea was that he would sign the cars and they'd all be numbered. And they were not like, they weren't souped up versions of it. They were pretty stock. Now, the Quattro back then was, in 85, an extraordinary car. Like, you got to remember, almost everything, a Kia is 4-wheel drive today. Like, everything is 4-wheel drive. But back then, Audi had the corner on the market of the 4-wheel drive cars, them and Subaru. They, of course, were, the Group B, badass rally cars, too. But the engines put out the 126 horsepower. But you could just sit there with the car floored the whole time and never worry about it because the Quattro took care of everything. It was a cool car. It was a great idea for it to go across the United States in any kind of weather condition. They didn't know what they were going to drive through. From my understanding, it's 6 he made for Jacksonville store, because this was kind of a way of promoting their new Audi stores. 1 in Jacksonville and 1 in Atlanta. And the one Ed bought was one of the Jacksonville cars. It was number 1. And mine was number 11, which came out of Atlanta. It was a relatively stock car. It was more of a image package. They put in Recaro seats. They special ordered them from the factory with a gray leather interior. And then they got a matching front Recaro seats made in matching leather. So the entire interior was this kind of cool gray. And the seats had little Cannonball patches on them. They had a badge on the center with the number of the car saying One Lap Cannonball on it. They had a Nardi steering wheel in matching gray leather. They had gaudy wheels on them. Now, Ed's car didn't have them on there, but my car did. That was the spare set of wheels. He took the gaudy wheels off because they were too special, and it was running on stock wheels. So when I opened up the boxes, and there are a restored set of like these impossible to get gaudy wheels. I found later in his boxes of things, he had center badges made up in case they ever got scratched. So I have probably the largest collection of gaudy center badges ever created. There's Brock Yates' signature on the back. They moved some badging around. They had some fog lights on the front. It was just an appearance package. It was kind of a celebration of the One Lap in Cannonball. So I get the car, and one of the stipulations of my purchase of the car, because I felt like I was in line with other people, like she could have moved down the line, I wanted to straight up raise the ante. And I said, if you sell me this car, I will cannonball it in his honor. And she's like, all right, okay. Like that hopefully was what pushed it over the edge. Because apparently he was a huge Cannonball fan, never got to actually cannonball the car because there were no Cannonball events. They obviously all over until the 2904 came back. I made that promise, and I'm like, we got to get the car ready in case this ever happens. Now, I wasn't going to do another 2904. I was over in 2017. And the C2C Express ended in 2019. I'm like, well, maybe I'll just fly it out there and we'll just do a solo run, which is, I'm not about single car runs. I don't like it. I see no point in driving in one car across the United States by yourself. Not that people haven't done it, Ed and Doug and all you guys, but to each his own. I needed to cannonball the Cannonball Audi at some point. And we got it ready, brought it to my shop, mechanic Matt laid into it. We did a service to it, and the car is actually in great condition. He really took care of it. There were 2 dents on it, one on the roof right next to the sunroof and one on the door. And if I remember this correctly, Amy told me the dent was from Art's ex-wife. Like she knew that he loved the car, so the dent on the roof is her fist. Like a goodbye, boom. And I'm hesitant to take the dent out because it's part of the story, right? So it's got 2 little dents, but otherwise in great shape. And having been from the Northwest, it was no rust and it was pretty clean, which I was happy with. But he did have a box of records in it. I love digging through records. I really, when cars come with records, I'm the guy who puts them in date order and reads them all because I want to see, the history of the car. So I went through all of them, and there were 2 binders, which I thought were just fascinating. So he bought the car in 85. In 86, the wheels get stolen. Every letter he wrote, because this is back in the day before email, you had to write letters. Every letter he wrote is in there showing the course of how he rode Brumos, and he's like, my wheels were stolen. He's got a picture of the car sitting up on blocks, document it, and he writes Brumos. He goes, the wheels got stolen. I need new wheels. And Brumos is like, good luck, because Gotti apparently moves on. They do one wheel style and they moved on. And they had to dig up a set of these Gotti wheels and charged him $2,800 in 1986, which in today's money has got to be $1 million, right? A couple of years later, like 1990, and I don't know where he's parking this car or how rough Seattle is or whatever, the front seats get stolen. Now, again, these are specially made Recaro seats. He's writing Recaro, he's writing Brumos, he's writing the president of Italy. Like, whoever will listen to him, he's writing them because he's going to find these original Recaro seats. And even Brumos is like, we had those specially made. Good luck. And he was persistent. And you could just read him. He's so passionate about this car. He finds the seats in the original gray. So my seats are missing the Cannonball logo on them, which I'll have remade eventually. But they are the correct model Recaro seats in the correct color back in the car. I mean, he even went as far as the Gotti wheels get dented like a year later. And I mean, there's like it's this thick, an inch, each one of these things happen. It's like an inch thick of correspondence. This one's got bags of photographs of the road that he drove on and the expansion joint or wherever they were doing construction that the car went over and dented his impossible to get Gotti wheels. So he went after the city, and there's letters to the city and letters back from the city, and he's just hammering them. And we all know if you try to fight City Hall, you're going to lose. Not Art. This guy stuck with it, and they paid him out to get the wheels fixed. So when I put on a fresh set of tires, you could see the repair inside one of the wheels where it was dented. This was his love of his life. And I'm like, I respect that. I so respect that. It's time now, to cannonball the car. So I take it out. I want to test it out. And I owned an Audi 4000S, a front-wheel drive car, years ago, which is my commuter car. And I knew how awfully slow they are. The Quattro has the 5-cylinder engine. The front-wheel drive cars have the 4. So I had a little bit more power, but you're losing that in the Quattro. So you're not really gaining a whole lot much. And I took it on the Andiamo rally up in the Sierra Nevadas. It's a 1,000-mile rally. This car hasn't turned a wheel in years. And it was fantastic. I mean, there is nothing like driving a slow car fast. I'm out there with like 612 Ferraris and guys with all this heavy McLarens and all this cool machinery, and I'm into my 85 Quattro. And believe me, when we parked with all this beautiful hardware, there's Alfa Romeos and there's a Cobra and all this, people are looking at the Audi. They're coming over to me like, oh, this is so cool. We did this full rally. We drove around 1,000 miles. We did laps at Thunder Hill. I respect Audi Quattro so much more now because you can leave the pedal floored in a corner and just turn the wheel. And whatever the magic the Germans stuffed into that system will just keep the car. There's no active computers working on. This is all mechanical. It just sends you through the corner. The car leans over a little bit because it's the 80s, right? It's not super stiff. Car rolls over. Once it rolls over, you can go through anything. I fell in love with the Audi Quattro. And my wife knew. Like, I came back and she's like, you're falling in love with the car. I'm like, yeah, I am. Now, can it get across the country? Now, one of the drawbacks of a lot of German cars in the 70s and 80s, especially when they came to the United States, they gear them differently. They don't have like these Autobahn gears in them. They were slow. They weren't terribly fast cars. So they put lower gear sets in it. It had the car I have is a close ratio transmission, and the fifth gear isn't all that tall. At 80 miles an hour, I think it was 4,000 RPM. In a car that old, you don't want to be cranking out that kind of RPM. You know, granted, the red line's well over 6, but it's still a geezer of an engine. So I'm like, all right, well, I think the only improvement I want to make, I didn't want to add a tank. I didn't want to change the car because it was so beautiful in stock. I thought, the only thing it really needs is a higher fifth gear. So I did a bunch of my internet research. I found out that there were a few transmissions. This is the 016, basically Volkswagen transmission that came in the Audis, came in Volkswagens, came in a bunch of things. And it also was in the 944 Porsches. So I figured I'd buy a transmission with a higher gear, a fifth gear, and I can drop the RPMs. Doesn't really have the power to push the RPMs, but it'll help it a little bit. So we found a 944 transmission, bought that, brought it in, took it apart. Mechanic Matt's under the car doing his thing, and it's not the same. That was $400, and I got to go find another one. I found out that the Audi 5000 Quattro Turbo had like the ideal gear. I'm like, where am I going to find one of these? I want to ship a transmission from across the country just to get this one cog and a synchro, essentially. And then I go online, and you're always despondent when you look for parts that are that rare, because how could they possibly be in your backyard? Boom, in my backyard, only a couple hours away. I call up the place, and I'm like, do you have this transmission? Like, yes. Like, is it this transmission? Because these shops, if they stack transmissions on top of each other, they have the transmission. We go and grab it. It fits. Put it in. Now fifth gear is a whole 1,000 RPMs lower. Now it can make it. This car is ready to drive across the United States. It is shook down. It is going to do it. We took it to Radwood as the last kind of drive test when they started those again in the Bay Area. And I'm like, yeah, time to do it. I made a promise to cannonball it. I don't like going in single car cannonballs. So the only solution, really, my only avenue was to throw another cannonball. Now, it wasn't a 2904 because I said I was shutting that down. So we had to invent something new. And my good friend and compatriot and cannonballer, Pierce Plam, was the one who set it in motion. And he calls one day and goes, what if we do another cannonball event? I'm like, and my first reaction was like, no, bad idea. He's like, no, listen to me. He goes, last year, this is in 2020, everybody was going bonkers with the records, the COVID records, and all these high-powered cars. And he's like, we can do something different. Because I'm not about the overall record and the speed. It's got to be something interesting. Like the 2904 was about doing it on a budget of $2,904. What's the gambit? And he's like, we do it with slower cars to show you that you can go almost as fast as all these guys in these 700 horsepower Audis and BMWs and Mercedes. I'm like, okay, all right, this is working. He's all, instead of the cannonball, you call it the musket ball because it's smaller, slower, and a lot less accurate. And I'm like, okay. So he slowly talks me into it, and I chomp down on the bit. I'm like, all right. So we came up with the musket ball, which is a race for cars with less than 100 horsepower at the wheels, which the Audi fits in perfectly because it's only, depending on what you read, 126 horsepower or 115 horsepower when it was new. And then you put the Quattro in it and you rip off 25% of that. No way that car makes 100 horsepower at the wheels. The Audi fits the parameters. Let's do it. That's how we began the planning for the musket ball, which is a whole other story.
Who wants a free carbon fiber ring? Well, right now, Patrick Adair Designs is giving away a free carbon fiber ring with any purchase if you use the code VinWikiCF at checkout on their website. You can find them at the link in the description below. You can also follow along on Patrick Adair's YouTube channel. You've seen him here telling car stories, but over there, he documents his journey in entrepreneurism and some of the amazing things they do to create rings out of the most interesting materials from Earth and from space. So check them out now and thank them for their support of VinWiki.
I said, right, but as is doesn't cover fraud. Being in the car business, as is probably the case in many industries, is difficult if you have any integrity. The companies that don't have issues that are good, it's the ones that deal with the issues properly. But over the years in the car business, it's very difficult to feel good about operating with integrity because I see so many people being so successful at being shady car dealers. And I think that's true of a lot of industries. And there's a number of stories that illustrate that. One of the examples of that, and I won't name names because I never filed a lawsuit, but very prominent, highly regarded Ferrari dealer sold Challenge Stradale to me through a third-party auction. And on this auction, it was listed very specifically as no service records, no paintwork, no damage. And I even questioned them on that because I said, this is coming wholesale from a Ferrari dealer. Surely they must have some service records. And so I called my contact at the auction and said, can you look into this? Can you find out? And he confirmed, nope, there's absolutely no service records. I said, okay, well, that's weird, but whatever. I'll put in an appropriate bid given the lack of service history and assume that I have to do a major service. And, the car probably was serviced. It's just they don't want to release the records or something along those lines. So I bought the car. I noticed a couple small flaws on it when I got it, but nothing glaringly obvious. And about 6 months into this, I had my salesman call the Ferrari dealer that we had purchased it from, that claimed that there was no service history, no paintwork, and pretend to be the new owner of it and see if they would release the service records. Now, it's something that totally violates privacy laws. And, Ferrari is very, very tight on any sort of client information or service history or whatever. You could not do that today. But he found the one secretary that was willing to help him out, and he's a bit of a smooth talker anyway, and got her to immediately fax over all of the service records, of which there were many, very many. And about halfway through these service records was a $40,000 bill for a quote-unquote off-road excursion. And it was the rear wheel and the rear spindle and hub and carbon ceramic brake rotor and rocker panel. And it really wasn't much body damage. It was just a lot of bolt-on parts, but those add up quickly with Ferrari. And I went back to the auction company and said, hey, this is on you guys because, it's here in writing, no paintwork, no damage, no service history, and that is not the case. And they said, well, if you had brought this up, within a couple weeks, we'd happily take the car back, but since so much time has passed, it's really not our concern. I said, okay, well, it's sucky, but kind of a valid point. So I called the general manager of Ferrari dealer and tried to go up the chain and all that. And they essentially said, well, you're a car dealer, so it's as is. I said, right, but as is doesn't cover fraud. It's one thing to complain because the car broke as I was leaving. That's as is. But when you guys, put Marvel Mystery Oil in the engine and that's why it broke when I was leaving, that is not covered by as is. That's fraud. And I have the documentation right here that says that you guys covered up and willfully misled me. And they basically just said, you know what? Sue us. They just didn't care. They were fat and happy. They were making a crap ton of money, and they weren't concerned with me. And I did look into suing them. I didn't end up doing it, mostly because my attorney at the time just kind of like dropped the ball. He never, I said, let's go, let's do this. Like, should be an open and shut case. They have tons of money, never materialized. So they made their money. It cost me, I think, $40,000 in diminished value because it took that long to sell the car. And once I knew about the damage, I had to, discount the car even more. A big time Ferrari dealer with a big time Ferrari Challenge racing team, made their money on the car and screwed me, the little guy. Exhibit number 2. Me and my boy John Sabo went out to this farm in the middle of Newton Falls, Ohio, to buy a 1969 911T Sportomatic. That was the first clutchless manual automatic conglomeration of weird transmissions that Porsche tried. It was a super weird thing because you shift it like a stick, but there's no clutch pedal. But when you grab the shifter, it essentially engages the clutch type apparatus so that you can then shift it. It's a very weird sensation. Anyway, we go out to this farm, probably the most unlikely place that you'd expect to find a vintage air-cooled Porsche. It was definitely, old school redneck Midwestern farmer, but he had a bunch of garages and a bunch of weird memorabilia, and he had this 911T Sportomatic that had a ducktail on it and aftermarket wheels, and I think it was a Targa as well, and it was a little bit of a Frankenstein. He had a Mercedes 450 SL as well that had gold wire wheels with the knockoff caps and side pipes, and he had some odd taste. Some real Frankenstein hot rod German cars. So we made a deal on the 911T, and got it back and serviced it and did a little bit of paint work. And I think we took the ducktail off and tried to put it back more to original spec, although it wasn't totally original. The biggest thing about the car was that it wasn't the original motor, and we knew that. And when we put it up for sale, we advertised it as such. This is a non-matching numbers car, and of course everybody wants matching numbers. Although on a 911T Sportomatic, who really cares, because they're not collectible anyway. But that was the question people kept asking. I'm like, the car's like 35 grand. Who cares? Like, just buy it and drive it. But we had this buyer that was interested from overseas. He was very concerned about the non-matching numbers, and he kept asking us and kept trying to buy it, kept coming back around. I'm interested in the car, but I really only want to give you like 28 grand because it's non-matching numbers. I said, I can't do that. Like, we bought the car right, but I know it's still worth 30 something, and I'm going to hold out for that. So as much as he really wanted the car, he couldn't get over that it was non-matching numbers. So we ended up selling it to a dealer in Colorado, and the dealer claimed that he was buying it for his personal car, heard that one a million times before, and was very nice and gave us what we wanted. I think we settled on like 34 grand, shipped it out to him, and I didn't think any more of it. I try not to pay attention to cars after they're sold too much, because I don't want to find out that somebody's asking a bunch more money and then feel bad about what I got. I was happy with the deal. A couple weeks later, I get a call from this same customer overseas, and he goes, "Hey, so are you sure that car wasn't matching numbers?" I was like, yeah, like, we got the certificate of authenticity. It was a different motor number. Like, that is not the original motor. And I think it was a hot rod motor too. It was hopped up on performance, but, again, not original. He goes, well, because the guy in Colorado put it up on eBay and he claimed it was matching numbers. And I bought it from him for 40 grand because he said it was matching numbers. I'm like, why? Why would you think, after 5 conversations with me, that I proved it wasn't matching numbers, that just because this guy said it was matching numbers, that all of a sudden you believe him? So he ended up paying 10 grand more than he offered me, just because some shisty dealer told him that it was matching numbers, even though he knew that it wasn't, and then called me to essentially cry in his milk, and not only I made him feel bad, but he made me feel bad, because I'm like, man, now thanks. Like, I left 10 grand on the table because I literally because I didn't lie to you and somebody else lied to you and made a bunch of money off you. Exhibit number 3, 2009-ish Corvette ZR1. Bought it from a dealer with whom I had a good relationship. It was a good client of his, super nice car, and I wholesaled it to another dealer in the Midwest. And I hadn't seen the car. I was going off of my contact's word, who I trusted. The owner claimed that it was a perfect car, all original, all that. Showed up to the dealer. The dealer called me and said, "Hey, the front bumper's been painted." I was like, "Okay, well, I wasn't aware of that." He goes, "Well, yeah, well, there's a receipt in the glove box." I was like, "Well, that was real smart of the owner to lie about paintwork and then leave the receipt in the glove box." But I'm like, okay, fine, front bumper. Like, that's not that big of a deal. That happens all the time, sometimes for rock chips. And he goes, "Well, it's awful. Like, it's all misaligned. It doesn't match and all that." And he sent me pictures, and I said, I'm not seeing what you're seeing, but okay, fine. This is on me because you have a receipt for it, and I didn't disclose it because I didn't know it. So what do I need to do to make it right? It's like $800-900 probably to paint the front bumper. And he says, "Well, I'm going to get an estimate. I'm not necessarily going to pay for the estimate. Let's just figure out what the number is." And I didn't hear from him for a couple of weeks. He sends me this estimate that includes repainting the entire front end of the car, replacing the headlights, replacing the bumper, I think, and like blending into the doors. And it was a multi-$1,000 estimate. And I said, "Dude, you are out of your mind. Like, it's a front bumper. There's a visual break there. You're not going to repaint the car and devalue the car because you need to respray a front bumper." He just went off and started playing the lawyer up card. He said, "Well, I'm just going to go get it fixed." And I basically said, "I'm not authorizing this invoice. Like, no. Like, you do whatever you want, but I'm not authorizing this." Essentially, my guess was that he was, number one, he was in cahoots with the body shop, because no rational body shop would write that kind of an estimate for a front bumper repaint. And number two, his attorney had no idea that these conversations were happening, even though he kept referencing his attorney and his attorney's opinion, because any reasonable attorney worth their salt would say, you have absolutely no case here, and you can't sue somebody over $3,000 or $4,000 because the retainer is going to cost you more than that. So it is not worth it. So he was just crying and threatening and all that in order to get something out of me. So long story short, we ended up settling for, I think, $1,200 because I just wanted to get him off my back. And I knew that somebody who was this irrational, if I told him to go pound sand, would probably take it to the internet and have his cronies try to like destroy my reputation on the internet and all that. I wasn't willing to fight that battle, which is unfortunately how most bullies get their way, especially in business, as they realize that, you know, it's not worth the fight for the other party, and so they'll just settle, and that's what I did. Exhibit number 4, Ferrari 355 Spider. Anybody that knows anything about Ferrari 355s is that you almost guaranteed have to get a compression and leak down test before you buy one of those. The early cars had valve guide issues, and even the ones that were fixed, it seems like those cars just have top end engine issues, because I've seen a lot of cars with bad compression and leak down. So I got offered a beautiful blue Ferrari 355 Spider a little while back from a private owner through a broker. And I said, okay, well, I'm interested in the car. Here's my offer, but I need a compression and leak down test. And the test came back and there was like 3 dead cylinders. The compression numbers were the same as the leak down percentages, if that tells you how bad it was. Like there was like 40-60% leak down on a couple cylinders and sub 100 PSI compression. It was bad. So I said, okay, well, my offer's, you know, 15 grand less now, or whatever it takes to rebuild the engine. And we were a couple grand apart, and I thought, man, this is actually great. I'm gonna get this gorgeous 355 Spider, and you know, we'll have it done right, and it'll be a fresh engine, and you know, this might actually be a pretty profitable deal. I think we were $1,000 apart from getting it, and the guy went totally silent. He sold it out from under me to somebody else who paid more money. And about a month later, I got offered the car from a dealer friend of mine who had bought it. He said, what do you think of this car? I said, And I just sent him back the screenshot of the compression and leak down numbers. He's like, oh no, this car drives great. It feels, pulls strong and all that. I was like, okay, well, your butt dyno needs calibration because it obviously has some issues. But, I asked him what he paid for it. I think he paid like 10 grand more than I had offered, and he knew nothing about it. So it's not only dealers that lie, but, this private owner just conveniently forgot about the compression and leak down numbers and found a different buyer who wasn't willing to do their due diligence and got a bunch more money for it. And that's not the first time a private party has done that either. I flew out to an Exhibit 5 to Connecticut to inspect a 996 GT3, a white one. And I got in and met the car at the shop where it was being serviced and took it for a test drive. And everything felt pretty good, but there was this noise from the rear end. And I initially thought it was brakes. It was just a very subtle grinding noise. But when I hit the brakes, it didn't go away, so it wasn't that. But when I put the clutch in, the noise went away. So I said, okay, well, this isn't good. This is a drivetrain noise. So I took the tech for a ride with me and said, hey, do you hear this? And he said, yeah, I do. It's transmission fork bushing, something or other. But it was a part of the transmission. And he said, that's a very early sign of that going bad, but that is definitely what you're hearing. And he said, that is a full transmission teardown. That's a $5,000-$7,000 repair. So went back to the owner, tried to renegotiate. We were a little bit apart. He was not super happy about that because he obviously wasn't aware of it. But I said, well, this is the issue. It's there. Your tech confirmed it, and we both rode in the car together. Again, ended up, he just ghosted me. And a couple weeks later, I see the car up for sale at another dealership. No mention of the issue, asking, 15 grand more than I thought it was worth given the issue, and of course probably just passed the issue down the road, and somebody unknowingly bought it and had to do a transmission repair, and the dealer made their money, and the owner got another 7 or 8 grand because he found a dealer that wasn't willing to check on it, and he didn't disclose the issue that we had come up with. But for all of these sob stories, there was one time where somebody else lying and me being honest ended up netting me a whole bunch more money. So I bought a Ferrari 328, really nice car from a wholesaler. And this was back in the day. I think I bought it for like 35 grand. Those were the days. And I got it in. Dealer that I do a lot of business with wanted the car. So I cut him a deal. I think I sold it to him for like 38 grand, 39 grand. Quick wholesale deal, no big deal. And shipped it right to him. And he got the car and he called me. He said, man, the whole car's been painted, or the whole back end of the car has been painted. I said, no, there's no way. That car was really nice. He said, no, the whole back end of the car has been painted. I said, okay, well, fine. I sold it to you for 38 grand. Like, you really can't complain, but since you are complaining, I'll send a truck, I'll send your money back. No harm, no foul. Happy to take the car back. I'll sell it to somebody else because I thought the car was nice. So we shipped the car back, and once we got the car back, we went over the whole car with the paint meter. Now, paint gauge is not a perfect indication of whether or not a car's been painted, but it's usually a pretty good indication. And the body panels were dead even, factory thickness across the board. Me and a couple other guys all looked at it, searching for paintwork. We're like, there's no way. This car is totally original paint. I think the guy just got cold feet and wanted to return the car. So I said, all right, well, he's the idiot. We got the car back, and it didn't take us long, and we ended up retailing the car for another 10 grand more than I had wholesaled it to him for. So the liar got screwed, and I finally got my due and made a whole bunch more money because we operated with integrity. We're willing to stand behind a car that we didn't think had issues and didn't, and ended up selling it to somebody else for a whole bunch more money. Sold that guy 2 cars and ended up actually getting them both back in on trade and sold them again, and ended up with a great relationship with a retail customer as a result.
Who wants a free carbon fiber ring? Well, right now, Patrick Adair Designs is giving away a free carbon fiber ring with any purchase if you use the code VinWikiCF at checkout on their website. You can find them at the link in the description below. You can also follow along on Patrick Adair's YouTube channel. You've seen him here telling car stories, but over there, he documents his journey in entrepreneurism and some of the amazing things they do to create rings out of the most interesting materials from Earth and from space. So check them out now and thank them for their support of VinWiki.
I've been obsessed with cars since I was 2 years old. I would chase my mom around the house with Hot Wheels. I feel like there's guys that like cars, and then there's really true car guys that like almost hurts to the soul. It's just intrinsic. You can't help it. There's no explanation. My dad liked cars, but he wasn't a crazy car nut like me. I would visit my aunt in Tulsa. She would give me spending money to go shopping, and I spent all my money on a DuPont registry. August of 1992, there was F40 on the front. We were in Walden Books, and she was like, "You're crazy, that's an expensive magazine, why do you want that?" And I was like, "I've got to have it." And I still have that magazine. And when I was 12 years old, I was just like, got to start saving for my first car. And so I knew how to cut grass, and so my first year I handed out some flyers and got 3 yards and started my lawn business. As time went on, I would wake up in the morning, I'd get my lawn equipment, we'd get to our first lawn, wait for the sun to come up, and then get a couple yards done, go to school. Sometimes I would skip lunch and go cut grass. So I was just obsessed with making money, and cutting grass was the best way I knew how to do it to buy better cars. I went to college, played a little soccer in college, and just my phone was getting blown up with problems with my guys out working. So I was in statistics class, grabbed my stuff, left, and looked back at the building and said, I'll never step foot in a college or in a university class again. And so I just went to work, and it was like a huge load off my plate. As it evolved, my cars evolved. I went from a Corvette to a Viper. I've owned 14 Vipers. I just got obsessed with Vipers. I was buying and selling Vipers. But then, my obsession's always been exotics, and that was kind of like an entry level, if you will. But I got into Lamborghinis. My first true exotic was the 91 Diablo. It was a terrible experience. I got it, and the clutch was already messed up. Had to put a clutch in it. What I was really after is a Gallardo. So bought a 2004 6-speed Gallardo, had that thing for 5 years, drove it 35,000 miles. It was incredible. 0 issues. Never had a single issue with that car. Fast forward to 2016, and I have a Ford GT. I bought the Ford GT in 2015 at 05. They came out, and said, "Hey, we're announcing we're going to have a new Ford GT come 2017." And it was in 2016. And there was an application process. And I was so intrigued by that. And I was like, the only downfall of that is I've got no chance. I was busy. I was busy working. And, by this time, we're mainly a design, build, landscape firm, not really doing much maintenance anymore. The applications, the window comes and goes. So the last second, I just fill out an application. I'm like, I've got to at least do it. Really half-hearted the deal. And, 6 months later, I get a nice letter saying, yeah, we're declining your opportunity to buy this. And, I was just kind of mad at myself. I was like, I really should have tried harder. Not that I actually had a chance to get a Ford GT. So 2018 comes around, and I'm like, hey, we're going to build another 350 cars. We're re-releasing the application process. And so at this point, I was like, man, this time I've got to go all out. And I called my buddy Kyle from 1320 Video. He'd been videoing me street racing and drag racing over the years. So he and I became good buddies. And I was like, man, what are some ideas we can come up with? So we get to like 3 weeks before it's due. And a friend local to me is a videographer and a car guy. His name's Charles. And so Imagine Productions is his company name. But I said, Charles, we've got to do a video. 3 days before the application videos and the application is due, I call him like, dude, I've got like a 4-hour window. Can we make it happen? He's like, let's do it. I've got my 3-year-old daughter in a car seat in the front of the Ford GT, and that was common. I really think I owe Isabella this Ford GT because she, I really believe, is the reason that I got this car. At the very beginning of the video, we're singing Jingle Bells or something along those lines, and I hit it, and her legs go up and her arms go up, and she just, like any other day of the week, she's just loving it and screaming and having a good time. Sent off the application, figured I'll get another nice declined letter months from now. So I'm actually sitting at a Nike outlet store as I'm just kind of doing the checking of the emails. I see Ford Concierge, and I was like, what is that? Because it was a different looking email than my original declined email. So I open it up, and the first word is congratulations. And I was like, oh my gosh. Behind every good man is a good woman. And my wife just accepts my car obsession. She always has. We dated for a long time, and my buddies called her the project because we dated for so long. This was just a celebratory moment for us. I called her, I was like, babe, we just kind of won a small lottery. And she's like, what do you mean? I was like, I got a Ford GT allocation. And she thought, that's cool. But she didn't realize, like, it, these cars are worth double or more what you're paying for them. And so once I explained that to her, she was just like, that's amazing. And what makes my wife so cool is, I was like, yeah, after 2 years we can sell it and make the money. She's like, you're not selling that car. She's like, she's the one that's telling me, no, we got to keep that. It's such a cool story. You've worked all your life for stuff like this. So why would you ever want to sell that car? And so my experience with Ford Concierge was just such a neat experience. It's so different than going to a Ford dealership and just, trying to buy a Mustang or something, and it just sometimes can feel a little greasy or whatever. Sometimes you have good experiences, sometimes not. Ford Concierge was just amazing. Met up with a guy named Sean. He was my concierge guy. He's a huge college football fan, as am I. So we instantly just hit it off. We would talk for 45 minutes to an hour about college football, about the Ford GT. I think my relationship that developed with him kind of caused my Ford GT experience to elevate. So they ended up offering me one of 20 Heritage cars, the Ken Miles car. The number 98, epic spec, just the way, the configuration with the carbon fiber and the paint. All along, Sean's like, yeah, we're going to get you a Heritage car. This is going to be awesome. And something just didn't align. I was just like, the only thing is, I really want this to be a car like I-spec. Like, I want it to be something like I pick out all the details, and I want it to be a one of one. And so I told him that. He's like, you're crazy, because the Heritage cars bring all the money. And he didn't say it in those words, but that's basically the conversation. And if you ever sell this thing, it's going to bring all the value. And I was like, I'm not in it for that. It's really about the experience. It's about the story. The money is a nice byproduct, but it's really about the car, because through and through, I'm a car guy, and the stories are what drive me. And so Tuesday nights was date night with Kirsten. And for these few months that I had to decide on options and things I wanted to do with this car, about 4 or 5 date nights, we'd go eat something fast, and we'd go walk car dealerships. The number one question I got after people found out I got the Ford GT allocation is, what color are you going to get? So I'd go into the story. Well, I've got the allocation now for a Heritage car. I should do that, but I really want to get something custom. We would go walk dealerships, and it was good, get some cardio in. We go walk dealerships, and I'd take pictures of colors that I liked. It could be Audis, BMWs, Porsches. It didn't matter. We were getting back in the car one night. The dealerships were closed, and she looks back at the local Porsche dealership, and she's like, what about the one inside? And there said a Miami blue 911. And I was like, and that's the color. Called Sean, said, hey, I want to do Miami blue. I'll send you some samples. I borrowed the samples from the Porsche dealership and mailed them up there. And Sean was just blown away. He was like, you're not going to do a Heritage. Like, we've never had someone turn down a Heritage allocation. Like, this is an elevated, like, you have to apply a second time to get a Heritage type thing. It's like, man, I want a Miami blue. Ford GT. They said we're probably 2 years out, so you've got 2 years to wait. And I was really disappointed because I thought once we started the decision making, and that's because I'm coming up, and they're like, no, sorry, you're probably going to be at end of 2021 or a 2022 model year. You would be a little earlier if you did the heritage cars because we're doing those first. And so I was like, man, that sucks. Because it was going to be 2 years, mentally, financially, I had teed up. Unfortunately, I sold my 2005 GT. I wasn't driving it as much. I had a McLaren 720 that I fell in love with. I was daily driving it, and the Ford GT was sitting a little bit more. So I'd sold it. That was kind of my down payment. You had to put 50% up front. So I'd sold it to kind of get ready, get geared up. And then they tell me, and this is like a couple of months later, they tell me, oh yeah, you're going to be 2 years before you see this thing. I was like, ugh. So I had, since August of 1992, the DuPont Registry with the F40 on front, which I've still got that magazine. I still look at that magazine pretty regularly, actually. I've got some road and tracks too of that era, but I was like, okay, F40 time. Joe Saki, F40 specialist in the United States. I was like, let's find a car. Very quickly found me a car. This was actually before I found out about the 2 years. And he found me a car, and it was right in the middle of the Ford GT situation going on. It was an 8,000 mile car for 1.3. And if it comes from Joe, then you know it's going to be perfect. I was like, man, I just found out I'm getting a Ford GT. I've got to save my money for that. Fast forward a few months, they tell me it's going to be a couple years, and I get wind of a red Veyron, also a car that I was just in love with. Veyrons had gone on a dip. They were $1 million asking. You know, you could find them for under that. So I was like, I've got 2 years. I'm going to go buy something like a Veyron and enjoy it. And a friend of mine had a red Veyron he was selling. It was Houston Cross's red 2008 Veyron. Sick car. And I went down to Dallas and test drove that. And as we're negotiating price, I get this email. I mean, literally days. Within these days, I get this email. Hey, your allocation, we're getting pushed up. I didn't ask them why, but my allocation got pushed up nearly a year. And they were like, it's going to be end of 2020, early 2021. Maybe somebody backed out of their allocation. I can't imagine why you'd back out of a Ford GT when you can double your money. But I had to pass on the red Veyron. So they said, yeah, Ford GT is going to be on its way. We're in the middle of COVID and delay. And so, and man, that is really, really hard when you're so anxious to get this brand new Ford GT that you got so fortunate. You know, when celebrities, major YouTube guys that applied for these didn't get one, and this lawn boy from Edmond, Oklahoma gets an allocation. Like, it's such a neat experience. The excitement was just like next level. Weeks were going by, months were going by. I was just like, I just had to stay busy and not think about it. But April 2nd, 2021 is whenever it was going to be delivered. You know how anytime you get a car delivered, the shipper, the auto shippers, they're always late. They always get a day behind or 2 days, or they're never on time. So I was mentally like, there's no way. It's 9 a.m. They said it'll show up at the Ford dealership. I was like, there's no chance. Sure enough, 8:57, the reliable truck starts pulling by. I was like, oh, it just made the feeling all the better, not having to sit there and wait that last couple hours, waiting on the show, finally get there. My wife and my Isabella was there with me, sharing that experience with them. It's an emotional thing for me. Like, I was just overcome with emotion. Ford did such an incredible job, for guys that were lucky enough to get one, just how they treated the process. It was such a 5-star experience. It was an epic experience for sure.
We'd like to thank Glossit for supporting the VinWiki channel this month. And right now, Glossit is offering the best DIY ceramic coating package that we've ever seen, or certainly offered here on VinWiki. For just $69.99, you're going to get their graphene ceramic coating along with the real difference maker, their ceramic detail spray. Now that's a $50 bottle of spray detailer that I truly love just for daily use. But when you use that alongside their graphene ceramic coating, it makes the removal a lot easier, the outcome a lot smoother, you avoid high spots and things like that. So a DIY idiot like me in my own garage can achieve an outcome pretty similar to what Rich and his team were able to do last year on the Paris Hilton SLR, which I eventually torture tested on rallies and road trips and all this stuff, and it is now in Bulgaria, still looking wonderful. So check it out now at the link in the description below. There's a very limited quantity, so respond now and get yours for just $69.99. Thanks, Glossit. Now these cars had been sitting for quite some time. The pictures of them were dusty, the kind of thing that just gets me really, really excited. Now there are supercars and hypercars all around the world, but more than anywhere else, they are here in the United States. And the primary reason for that is that it's one of the cheapest places on earth to own an automobile. Doesn't matter if it's a Honda Civic or a Koenigsegg, the US is a very inexpensive place to own a car. Now, of course, we have a lot of people complaining about the fact that in the last 6 months, gasoline prices have increased by 50% or so. But it still costs less than half to buy a gallon of gasoline here than a gallon of petrol elsewhere in the world. And so even though people are complaining, it is a very, very cheap place to buy a car, to insure a car, to park a car. All the things that surround automobile ownership are cheap in the United States. When we buy a new car, it will have had some tariff levied, but again, it's not all that much. And the registration costs and the sales taxes and things generally don't amount to anywhere near 10% of the car's value. Now, elsewhere in the world, those import duties and tariffs can be more than 100, even 200% of a car's value, which is a lot on a normal passenger car, but on a hypercar level purchase price of millions of dollars, it is a lot. Now, even here in the US, we've talked about the Montana LLCs that people form to get around sales taxes, but you can imagine the lengths to which people are willing to go in other parts of the world to avoid 7-figure tariffs, duties, or registration fees are pretty substantial. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned over and over again that I love about the relationship with the VinWiki audience is that you guys send me all of the interesting cars that pop up for sale, especially if they have a terrible or interesting story to them. And so I love that. I appreciate it. I do apologize that I cannot respond to all of the messages, but I have bought many of the cars and I definitely appreciate it also, even if I don't respond, because it's honestly hundreds of messages, 200 or 300 messages a day, most of the time that you guys are sending me with different ideas, different cars that you found. And so I try to respond when I can, but I apologize. But regardless, know that I did see it. And at least if I'm just scrolling through, I do my best. But about a week ago, my inbox started to be filled up with screenshots from a couple of Instagram accounts that were publicizing 2 different Koenigsegg auctions. And this was fascinating because it was not older Koenigsegg's. I'd done a video a few months ago about my pursuit of trying to buy a couple of seized Koenigsegg CCRs that were in Korea. These were in fact an Agera RS and a Regera, or Regera, lots of different pronunciations, but the cars from Ängelholm, Sweden. And as we know, the version of the Agera had bested the Bugatti Veyron Supersport's top speed record. Super duper cool cars, may or may not have been bested by the Tuatara since then, but regardless, awesome. Now these cars had been sitting for quite some time. The pictures of them were dusty, the kind of thing that just gets me really, really excited. And I was contacted by a guy named Mika who owns the YesGo Registry Instagram page, and his friends have the Ghost Squadron page, and there's a bunch of people who are dyed-in-the-wool enthusiasts for the Koenigsegg cars. And that's one of the most interesting things to me about the enthusiast relationship with Koenigsegg as an auto manufacturer is that the audience of people who are just so over the moon wild about these cars are doing a wonderful job of curating the history. In the same way that I cared so much about letting the world know exactly what the existing manual LP640s were and how rare they are, these guys have been documenting from day zero. As soon as they see a car being tested, they start to catalog where it's seen, what the specs are, what the unique options are, and it goes into their registries and they do a brilliant job. And so I'm hugely impressed by these guys, and I know that they're doing it so that when they own one day, it'll feel even more special, and I know that it will. But they gave me a lot more insight into what the story of these cars were. Now, each of them had been smuggled into China because in China, the registration cost would have been 100 to 200% on top of the $2+ million MSRP that each of these cars would have had. And the two cars were up for sale on the Jinpai platform, which is something that the Chinese government uses to auction off seized goods. And if a car is being smuggled in to avoid taxes, it is within their purview, I understand it, to seize the car. So these had been forfeited by the owners, and it was unclear if they were both owned by the same person, but they were both seized sometime in 2019. Now, throughout the time since then, there had been multiple efforts by the government to sell them either through brokers or through closed bid auctions or things like that. But generally, when these countries or even the US government tries to sell a car in such a circumstance, there's a lot of restrictions. And even in the verbiage that they used for these auctions, it appears that you have to be a Chinese citizen to bid. Now that's up for some interpretation. The way it's phrased is a disclaimer that all citizens, legal persons, and other organizations with the full capacity for civil conduct can participate in the bidding. So presumably, if you're not a Chinese person, you may not be able to bid. Regardless, it's a little bit outside of my pay grade, so I'm not going to be bidding on one of these cars, but it is fascinating to me exactly what the cars are. Both of these cars are listed on this Chinese auction platform, and the starting bid of the Agera RS is about $2.2 million, and the starting bid of the Regera is about $2.5 million. Now, theoretically, the Agera is more rare and should be worth a bit more money than the Regera. The reputation is that they run a little bit better. It doesn't involve some of the cutting edge technology that Koenigsegg engineered into the Regera cars, which is super cool. But again, you don't see a whole lot of them racking up a ton of miles. The Agera would probably sell in perfect condition in a totally open market in the threes, maybe touching $4 million based on some recent comps. Difficult to say what the Regera is going to bring, but regardless, both super fantastic cars, presumably with delivery miles, because there was no evidence that the cars were widely used. Now, there are several legally imported and registered Koenigsegg's in China. There are 4 Agera Rs. There's one that's considered to be an R+, because it was sort of rebuilt by the factory after a drunk driving accident. And there is a CCR. Now, all these paid the duties and things like that. And so they're allowed to be there, but this was the only RS that was imported, and obviously that was unsuccessful. So that car's up for sale. The Regera is configured almost exactly like the original factory prototype car. In fact, when I saw it, I thought, well, that's strange. I mean, I didn't imagine somebody would have immediately duplicated that spec. And it's not exact. These guys from the Instagram accounts can point out all the intricacies and differences and that it doesn't have all the aero and carbon options. But again, it's just sitting there. And it has been for so long, through several failed sales, some through a German broker, but regardless, the cars are there, they are for sale. They're being sold with a certificate of confiscation of smuggled cars and motorcycles, a uniform invoice of motor vehicle sales, and confirmation of auction transaction, which I presume in most countries would allow you to import it. Now in the US, you'd either need to get a letter of compliance from Koenigsegg, which I believe they'd probably be able to put together. You'd have to federalize the car or apply for show and display. And I don't believe they're technically eligible for show and display based on precedent, meaning I don't think anybody's done it yet. They should be rare enough to qualify for show or display, but regardless, they are for sale. Now, it'll be interesting to watch and see exactly what they bring, but my honest hope is that they sell for great money in a representation of the healthy market for truly rare and special cars that we've continued to see, and that they go somewhere where they actually get driven. It's a shame to see cars like this just sitting around and rotting, and I cannot imagine the reconditioning that will be required to get them mechanically sound again, but it is possible. But the great thing is there are cars like this all over the world, and it's one of my favorite things about the stories we get to share here on VinWiki is for everybody to be able to know just how cool, just how special, and how not terribly rare these really, really unique opportunities are to buy special cars in a depressed or challenged circumstance. Now, who knows if these will represent an amazing value, but the more that the market is limited, the more chance there is for that to happen. When I was trying to bid on those Korean Koenigsegg's, which those were CCRs and they were going to be a whole lot cheaper than what these were, they ended up selling in the $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 range, and I think they've resold since then. That might have been within reach for me, but these really aren't. And I don't know that it would be the place that I would put my $2 million, but the amazing thing about the economy and about the market for cars like this is that there are buyers for so many of these rarefied multi-million dollar hypercars. And so whatever your dream car is, even if you can't afford it, these are the examples that I want you to hold on to as truth that you are going to be able one day to find your dream car, maybe not in your dream condition, but in a condition that hopefully fits your budget. I just wish this one fit mine. We'd like to thank Auto Tempest for now their 4th year of supporting VinWiki and for their ongoing support of CarTrek. Auto Tempest is the most powerful way to shop for your next car. They allow you to shop through all the major listing sites at the same time. You enter in your criteria once and it shows you everything. They even allow you to search nationally amongst Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist, which you can't do on their own sites. Also, if you're looking for things that aren't cars, use their site Search Tempest. In the same way, you can nationally search for collectibles and electronics and anything else that you want to buy. It makes it a whole lot easier, and it's helped me out a whole lot. Check out the recently released CarTrek 8 and thank Auto Tempest for their ongoing support of VinWiki by looking for your next car at the link in the description below. What anybody in the 80s would do, he filled it with drugs and he drove to Vegas. So every day I'm searching around the internet trying to find interesting cars to buy, always open to buying a whole lot of cars, but one car that I'd never personally been necessarily seeking out was an AMG Hammer. But last week I got a call from Ryan from the MB Market and told me that they were listing a car that he actually wanted to come and talk to me about. And he called it the Cocaine Hammer. I said, well, I like everything about that. Now, hammers are phenomenally rare and exceptionally misunderstood, and as best the records indicate, there are only 13 North American hammers. Now, there's not a consummate VIN list. They haven't canonized the rarity of these cars. There's 30 or so worldwide, but they don't come up for auction very often, and in fact, this was going to be the first public sale since the values have changed radically. Now, I've had several people come on and tell AMG pre-merger stories, and some of them have been about hammers, some have been about the way they modified cars, and most of the cars, in fact, all the hammers were built in Westmont, Illinois at AMG Chicago. And of course, a proper hammer has to be a 300 CE that's converted with an M117 4-cam 6-liter engine. Now, they came in coupes, came in sedans, there's one manual car, there's a handful of different colors, but again, there were only 13 real cars. Now, you'll hear things called hammers that have the later version of the M119, you'll hear them that are actually wide bodies with a 6-liter, you'll hear some that are just AMG cars. People believe they are hammers, but these legendary cars that dominated magazine tests that we saw just beating the world, including the supercars, the hypercars even of the day, these were faster and they were more expensive. And so, as Ryan explained this car to me, he actually told me the story. And I would say it's without question the best hammer story. And in that regard, I would actually say it's the best 80s supercar story that I've ever heard. And that is primarily because the second owner of this car, after less than 24 hours from its original sale date to the original owner, was the DEA. And they, in fact, drove it a whole lot further than that original owner was. So after the car was built at AMG Chicago in Westmont, Illinois, it was shipped to Beverly Hills Motoring, Andy Cohen's shop, and he was a huge AMG retailer. He did some of the modification, but also just threw on tons and tons of accessories. So when you bought an AMG in Newport Beach, it might come with $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 worth of add-on stuff, sheepskin seat covers, all this mess. So whatever, it was as 80s as you could possibly be. And of course, this has the monoblock AMG chrome wheels. It's a coupe. It's black. It's quintessential hammer. And immediately upon taking delivery, he does what anybody in the 80s would do. He filled it with drugs and he drove to Vegas. And so he's out blasting through the desert, as we've done many, many times, and apparently along the way, he drew the attention of some law enforcement. So he was being tailed by multiple police officers most of the way to Vegas, but he was going so fast in the fastest car of the day. Again, this was faster than a Countach, faster than a Testarossa, and it was filled with all the accoutrement you might imagine of an 80s Hammer. Eventually, he gets to his destination and stops. And a few minutes later, the cops catch up. They arrest him. Obviously, they search the car, they find some coke, they find some Quaaludes, they find all the drugs, and they take possession and ownership of the car. Now, they've got it for quite some time, and eventually, after driving it over 1,500 miles, they auction the car off, and it's purchased by professional baseball player Rob Deere. And in fact, he'd been in contact with the guy they were selling this Hammer for, at one point interested in maybe getting it back. So after he owns it for a while, loves the idea of having the ultimate 80s car, he trades the car back in at Symbolic in San Diego. Now, the current seller, I guess being a consummate car guy / occasional car broker, ends up having a request from a friend of his just to find like the most interesting car he could buy sometime in the mid-90s. And this guy, with a brilliant stroke of creativity, says, buy this Hammer. That guy does, owns it for a little over a decade, and eventually decides he wants to sell it. And the first person he mentions it to is his friend, the car guy. And he says, well, I'll just buy it from you. So about 15 years ago, the current owner, the seller on MB Market, buys the car. Honestly, just parks it. Now that is the thing to me, as somebody who has documented rare cars, caused them to go up in value, irresponsibly, as many would say, miled them up, driven them a lot, is the thing that's always kind of concerned me a little bit about the ultimate upside of the Hammers, because everybody who has one doesn't drive it. And it's an issue for a couple of reasons. One is that they are very finicky cars. The process of like bringing one back to life, the fuel systems are crazy, the heads are porous and they just leak inherently. They were built at the ragged edge of what was possible in the 1980s. That's how you make the world's fastest car. However, it makes them a little bit of a liability. So there's only a handful of proper experts that know how to rehabilitate and properly get one of these things back on the road and then actually drive it. Different experts like this have looked at the car. Some of them are being against me at the moment, hopefully unsuccessfully. Obviously, John and his team at Curated down in Miami, they've done several AMG cars, including a Hammer, and they're interested. Hopefully, again, not as aggressively as I'd like to be. But regardless, like, this is the first time that one is sold since they were worth less than $100,000. Now, nobody really knows what a Hammer is worth today, and that's why the auction was so interesting, obviously, because there was one that was sold, it was the wrong engine, it wasn't even really a Hammer. RM sold it as a Hammer, it didn't run, it brings $100,000, like that's not even, it's not a comp. There are no comps. There are rumors of some of these cars, both in the US and abroad, tickling seven figures. And I saw this thing, I said, well, I'm not buying a $1 million E-Class. I can't even believe I live in a world where there is a $1 million E-Class. But that being said, at some number, I gotta have it. So when this car was built on a new car, so a new car goes to AMG, and the total value of the car, at least on MSRP and plus whatever options would have been stuck on it, was almost $188,000. And most of that, the $40,000 for the engine, obviously was the focus of the build. It was built by somebody who wanted an AMG to drive. You'll see some of these things with extra sound systems and TV screens and obviously body kits and spoilers and things like that, different options for wheels. And again, that's a little bit where the confusion comes from in terms of what is a Hammer. And when I survey the market of like cars that have upside potential, now this whole inflationary crazy, maybe it's a downturn world notwithstanding, like rarity is key and legendary status is key. And documentation is key. Now, documentation is the weakness here because they kind of just threw stuff on cars and they didn't necessarily keep good records, and nobody's done a great job of curating the history of these legendary automobiles. And so as soon as somebody does that, and again, it's pretty low-hanging fruit. It was like, when I started the manual LP640 list, I thought there were 23 cars. That's how many I could find. Eventually, we found 22 coupes and 10 roadsters, but that took years and years. Nobody's expecting 40 more North American AMG hammers to come falling out of the woodwork. And there's enough other cars to maintain the excitement. Like in the same way that regular Murcielagos are awesome, manual LP640s are the ultimate ones, even better than SVs to those that argue the contrary. But I am really, really excited, and I've told several people this over the years, like, why haven't you guys all come together and written a declaration of rarity, all the VINs of all the cars, and then everybody who matters in that community sign off on it, and obviously make the list on VinWiki, and that's how you make them double in value. So Hartmut, who is the founder of Rentec, was the technician that built all these cars at AMG Chicago. And so he maintains sort of at least the most amazing memory bank of which cars he remembers wrenching on. And obviously they contacted him from MV Market. They talked to Hartmut. They said he did remember this car. He remembers most of them. And, you know, certainly it is as authenticated as one would have to be to justify the value. Because again, the cars are so rare that they don't transact incrementally. It's not as though one sold for 200 grand, then 500 grand, then 800 grand, then $1 million, all you know, in public Amelia Island auctions or anything like that. No, it's these rumored, you know, way off market deals that may or may not have ever happened. But this is the first time that one is going to publicly, fully documented sell. When Ryan tells me about the car, I'm like, well, darn it. I not to insult your burgeoning new auction platform that doesn't require anything towed to get to it, I am very interested in becoming the next owner of this car. And so at the moment, I am the high bidder, I will say. I don't know that I'll remain that way, but I am at least fascinated to have found what I think, again, is the car with the greatest 80s supercar history, the Cocaine Hammer. We love the team at Patrick Adair Designs because they make rings and other jewelry out of some of the most amazing and interesting materials on Earth and even occasionally from space. But they've honestly outdone themselves with their latest creation. They have made a series of rings using the aluminum that they cut out of an OEM wheel for a Bugatti Veyron. Obviously, I love the Bugatti Veyron, maybe one day, I hope, but they've also used forged carbon fiber, gold, and platinum to accent the rings however you want them. And honestly, as cool as the rings are, I think I like the case they come in even better. They have replicated the W16 engine on the top out of sterling silver. It's a cherry wood box with like carbon fiber and titanium screws. Super duper cool. So check it out now at the link in the description below to get yourself a super cool ring from a great company, Patrick Adair Designs. And if you order now during the month of July, you'll also get free at checkout either a carbon fiber ring or a tungsten pendant. So they've been a great supporter of VinWiki all these years, and they've created an awesome product here. So check it out now at the link in the description below.
The meep meep horn. I go and push it, and it doesn't meep meep. And I was pretty sad, but then things got so much worse. Well, I obviously have a lot of experience buying cars, and just about every seller is a liar. Sometimes it's by omission, but sometimes it's sort of on purpose. So I'll give you an example of omission. One of them is a 1983 Chrysler LeBaron that I purchased from a crazy man that owned 23 of them. And I called him up. He had a crazy ad that was shared everywhere on Jalopnik, all over the internet, advertising his entire collection of only Woody Chrysler LeBarons for sale, and I told him I wanted two things. I wanted one that talked, because that speak and spell box that would tell you in a deep voice that your engine oil pressure is low or your door is ajar. I definitely wanted that, and I also wanted one with no rust. He said, I have the perfect car for you, $3,500. Send it my way. It had holes through the floor that I could double fist. Every single panel had rust. I think the guy was just legitimately crazy, didn't know his inventory, and just sold me a car not really knowing what he had. Maybe he bought it 10 years ago and it wasn't rusty, and that's how he remembered it. I just think he was crazy. There was nothing I could do with the car, so I ended up digging a hole and burying it. When you're buying a cheap car, you sort of have to expect something like that. When you're buying a blue chip collectible, a $130,000 in my case, 1970 Plymouth Superbird, you expect a lot more. And unfortunately, it was one of the thickest wool ever pulled over my eyes. So to start out, this was on Bring a Trailer. It was on an auction. It was 7-day with the seller actually saying he had 2 Superbirds. So you kind of feel good about somebody who owns multiples of them. The other one was a restored 440 car from a very, very prestigious restorer, and this was a different car. So the 440 is the much more common one. Of course, the Superbird is a homologation special from an old NASCAR where you have the giant wing that they had to sell to the public to be legal in NASCAR. Of course, current NASCARs don't have to look anything like the current cars. It's just basically a shell and roll cage. But back in 1970, they actually had to look and really be mostly like the real cars you sell to the public. So they built a little less than 2,000 of these, most of them 440 cars. The race cars were all Hemis, but 135 of the cars were actually Hemis that were sold to the public, and the one that I bought is one of them. Now, it has quite a crazy story to it. It was raced in period, T-boned, and then it was listed in the Superbird registry as a partial rebody, so a little bit of a ding there. But I guess that gave somebody creative license to resto-mod it, which is something you would never ever do to a Superbird nowadays. I think there was a record price just recently of $990,000 for one that was only 6,000 original miles. So me getting one for $130,000 is a great deal, but it didn't have the original motor. Instead of it having the 426 Hemi, it had the 528, sort of a crate performance Hemi, a Tremec 5-speed. But I kind of liked that because that meant I could really drive and enjoy it and also have modern performance. But one takeaway was the suspension had been modified. Instead of the torsion bars, it had a coil-over suspension. But I knew this is going to be my cheapest way to get into one of these, probably my only chance to buy a Hemi Superbird, so I bid, even though the seller wasn't answering a lot of questions in the comment section. He was kind of keeping quiet on some things if some things worked, and I turned out to be the high bidder. And actually, I had no intention of buying a Superbird until about 24 hours before the auction was over, and I was talking to the wife. We were actually in the airport in Las Vegas leaving SEMA, and I asked her if it was okay, and she said, well, no, but then I talked some more. She finally said yes. My kid's actually napping on my chest as we wait for the plane, and I'm bidding. I get this for $130,000. I'm the winner of a Superbird, and I nearly missed the flight because I'm not paying attention. I'm so excited about owning a Superbird. So eventually the car gets shipped. Of course, I'm buying it sight unseen, no PPI, as most people do on Bring a Trailer. You kind of trust the seller to advertise things honestly. And this is where I don't think the seller was lying by omission, in a sense where, oh, I can get away with 1 or 2 things, you know, or maybe you forget because you don't drive the car very much. This car was never right from the moment it was built almost 10 years ago. So it was sold at a Barrett-Jackson auction during that period, and I think whoever built it just sort of put it together to look pretty to sell at auction. It had all the right pieces, but it was never put together quite right. And actually, it didn't originally look right either because the Superbirds are supposed to have a vinyl roof on them to sort of hide things, and they wanted to show that it was pretty, so they made it an all-metal roof. So this guy actually fixed that. He put the vinyl roof on it. He took off the hideous wheels because in that period, resto mods were kind of not so pretty with the chrome and extra bling and things. Nowadays, they'll be a lot more tasteful when they're building a resto mod to make it a lot more subtle. Say, for example, they'll take a stock 15-inch wheel, use that as a pattern to mill out, say, a 20-inch matching set, just totally custom to really look right. Subtle stuff, which this guy kind of tried to do. He put on some larger wheels that sort of looked like the period racing wheels. He actually fixed the suspension, which for some reason they set it up to look like sort of a dragster with the nose down. He jacked it all back up. But when he did that, he overextended the struts, and they had no way to, well, do any kind of suspension. So when I won the auction, my first thought was I got to go pick this thing up in person and drive it home because that would be awesome for a YouTube video. And the seller seemed pretty reluctant. He said probably not because it would use so much gas. You'd be stopping every 100 miles. And the suspension, he did disclose the one thing. When I jacked up the suspension, the coilovers need to be adjusted because it's not really riding right. It's riding really harshly. If you adjust it, then it'll be just fine. So I thought, well, okay, I'll ship it in. It shows up. I'm so excited. It is beautiful. The condition is astounding. It looks like it was restored yesterday. I hop in the car, so excited to own a Hemi Superbird. I go and honk the horn. It has the iconic Meep Meep horn from the Roadrunner, which the car was based on. The Roadrunners had the same horn. They actually licensed from Warner Brothers for the Roadrunner, and the Superbird had it as well. The Meep Meep horn. I go and push it, and it doesn't meep meep. And I was pretty sad, but then things got so much worse. I took it on the drive, and just leaving the neighborhood, the slightest bump, the whole car, it had no suspension whatsoever. It's like he put concrete blocks for struts, and I had nothing but the tires, and it just bounced like crazy. Even worse, I get up on the highway and the thing starts to overheat. It's also not running right. I barely get back to my house, and then it's just whistling like a teapot out the radiator cap. So obviously a total disaster. I'm able to drive it up to the Wizards though after I put a new radiator cap on it, and it's still running hot, and we go through and we inspect this thing, and it is an absolute mess. Basically, the seller, before the person that sold it to me, whoever put this together, it actually changed hands a few times, probably never used the car. It was sold at auction and then just sat because so many things weren't hooked up. The iconic horn didn't work because there was no wire going from the horn button to the horn itself. The vacuum pumps, which were controlling the headlights and a few other things, they'd put in 2 vacuum pumps for whatever reason, and they were so loud. It was noisier than the motor. You couldn't hear a 528 Hemi over the sound of these vacuum pumps that sounded like, well, a broken hairdryer and a vacuum just competing for the most annoying noise in the world. I mentioned the horn not being wired up, but the speedometer wasn't wired up, the fuel gauge wasn't wired up. There were a lot of things. What was wired up was a total disaster, and it was leaking from numerous places. So sellers can get away with 1 or 2 of these things, but then when it's 10 of these things, usually I start reaching out to the seller and say, well, hey, can we work something out here, or at least try to get a story? And I would ask certain things. I hadn't gotten a title yet, and I would ask, hey, I haven't got the title yet, and then 1 or 2 of these little issues. He would address the title issue and not the other issues. So then I would ask another set of questions, something small about the car, say how it works, and then ask about some more issues. He would only reply to that one. So then I got more pointed, would ask exactly about the issues. It just completely ghosted me. Did the total head in the sand thing. Wouldn't even respond like, oh, I didn't know. No excuse, no nothing, just no response to my text messages at all. And that's when I knew, well, I was on my own. There's no recourse, really, once you have the car in your hands. In these instances, when you pay $130,000 for a car, and obviously there's a lot of undisclosed issues, you would think, well, maybe Bring a Trailer can help, or whoever sold the car. I mean, these people, they're just the middleman. They're not really making any money except on the buyer's fee. They're hoping that the seller represents the car honestly, but you know that you're bidding like you're just dealing directly with the seller. Bring a Trailer is just posting the photos and writing a listing based on what the seller says. They're not responsible for fraudulent misrepresentation, but to their credit, they didn't want to make money on a bad deal. $5,000 was their fee. They refunded it back to me, which was a big help in getting started to fix all of these issues. The leaks from the oil cooler and numerous other places, that was pretty straightforward. Wiring up things to get them working again, like the horn, once again, pretty simple. But then the suspension, you had to get different struts, and that was a little bit of a bear to figure that out because it's a one-off thing you kind of had to figure out just based on measuring. A lot of other little things. And then the car was better about $3,000 later, but still not drivable because the engine didn't run right, it was way out of tune, and then it was also still overheating. So the next stop was the dyno tuner. That's sort of where my Mechanic the Car Wizard kind of ends, because he thinks the car's overheating because of the tune or something else, but since the car's running so poorly and needs a tune, I need to do that first before I can bring it back to him for the next round of repairs. So we go there to this great guy, Polk Performance, takes one look at the car, kind of shakes his head, but he's excited that it's a Hemi Superbird, but then notices that the pretty shroud they put around the radiator was right up against the radiator where the cooling fans mount, which blocked about 70% of the radiator flow. They just mounted it flush onto the radiator because there wasn't very much room with the accessories, say the AC compressor, to give it a little bit of a box for the air to flow. So he thought maybe drilling holes in it would help, which actually it did, but really we needed to build a whole new box to fix it. But then we found the next layer of, well, subterfuge, I imagine. Somebody did probably try to tune it once, not that long ago, because there was a cord on the floor that looked like, say, an old printer cord that you would plug into a laptop and be able to mess with the old Fastbox, which has a date code of about 2007. Something you could work with, but still pretty darn old. And it turns out it was the wrong plug. Unfortunately, it took us about 2 hours of rifling through all this mess of wiring to figure out that that's the wrong plug. But obviously someone had been there before, discovered they couldn't tune it, and just stopped. But then they just left the cord on the floor, which actually kind of sent us on a 2-hour-long scavenger hunt with this, false clue on the ground. So I wasn't able to tune the car, And, well, I thought I was screwed. I thought I was going to have to rewire the whole thing, which I probably should do because, well, it's still kind of a mess under there. But thankfully, the people who make the ECU fast, they were able to send us some wiring diagrams and some plugs and the actual diagnostic, plug port, the proper one. So when I go home from here, we're actually going to be able to throw it on the dyno now, and then maybe, I'm kind of doubtful. Maybe it will work, but this has been 6 months and thousands of dollars on a $130,000 car, nearly the most expensive car I have ever bought. And it really doesn't matter if it's a $1,000 hoopty or a six-figure car. When you're buying something from the internet sight unseen, even from the most reputable places, the spending doesn't stop with the purchase price. You're going to throw some money at it. Sometimes you get lucky, but a lot of times, well, you end up like me. I'm very fortunate because I have a YouTube channel, so when things are bad, it's good because I get more videos out of it. But if you're just buying yourself and buying your dream car, just brace yourself.
5 years ago, the first sponsor we ever had here on the VinWiki channel was Caffeine and Octane. Now, they're our local Atlanta Cars and Coffee meetup that I've been going to for 15 or so years now, but it is now the largest monthly recurring automotive gathering on Earth. Now, you'll also recognize Caffeine and Octane from their television show, and the next season of that airs very soon on Motor Trend. In their quest for further automotive world domination, they just bought the legendary Lanier Motor Speedway, which is across the street from Road Atlanta. So throughout the next year, we're going to have a lot of amazing events there that you'll be invited to join. But the coolest project they've deployed lately is called HighOctane.tv, and it's a free streaming network that you can access from any smart TV, Roku, Fire Stick, smartphone, or a computer, and it'll give you access to a ton of programming, including all 5 seasons of their show, some content from creators we love like David Patterson, That Dude in Blue, and a ton more. Soon there will be some content from VinWiki on there as well. So visit the link in the description below to learn more about the amazing world of Caffeine and Octane.
If you can imagine this, like 200 miles an hour, the car is wandering from one side of the road to the other, and these guys with their balls of steel are like, yeah, it's a little disturbing. Sometimes a race car comes along that upsets the apple cart, that changes the paradigm for racing. And this happens once in a generation. And probably one of the greatest cars that ever did that is the Porsche 917. Now, most people know the 917 from the movie Le Mans with Steve McQueen looking jaunty in his little Gulf-colored cars. And there's a whole lot more to the story than just that one movie. The car only had a 2.5-year racing career. And yet it's still remembered today, and it is worshipped today, decades later, because of what it accomplished in that short amount of time. You have to go back to the beginning to understand how special the 917 was in its origin. In 1967, after Le Mans, the FIA changed the rules, saying that it was time to put an end to the 7-liter GT40s that had come out. And they were going to restrict engine size coming up in the next couple of years. So prototypes were going to be 3 liters. Sports cars were going to be 5 liters. Now, the Ford-Ferrari wars that have been going on were about to end. Ford in 67 was like, we've done it, we made our point, we've spent millions of dollars to pull off this stunt. And they handed their whole GT40 program over to John Weir in England, sponsored by Gulf. And Porsche stepped in to now begin the Porsche-Ferrari wars. And they had already been moving their way up slowly through the ranks at Le Mans. They had never won a world championship. They had never won Le Mans, but they had won so much. For such a small company, they had done a tremendous amount in racing. And they had built the 906, then the 910 and the 907, the 908 was now their front-running car. And it was a 3-liter. And it fit perfectly into that prototype level. But Porsche sat back and was like, what about this 5-liter sports car thing? There's a hole in the rules here we can exploit. And they waited almost a full year to make a decision about that. And they really thought about it. And then they're like, let's do it. This is our opportunity to win everything. This is the path to victory at Le Mans. And they started building what would be known as the 917. Now, the beginning of it was the engine. They wanted to build that 5-liter rule. And they never built an engine that big. They had flat 6s and they had flat 8s. And they made the decision to make a flat 12. Now, they had never built this before. And it was June of 1968 where they gave them the green flag to start building this car. And they had to build it quick, from scratch, everything. They took 2 of their well-known and well-practiced 6-cylinders and put them together in the center. So, and I'll get a little geeky here because this is all tech stuff, but I love it. So, like, how do you get the power when you put the butt ends of an engine together? You could put a flywheel on one end of the crankshaft somewhere, but the crank is so long, you would just start getting vibrations in it, and it would just shake the engine apart. So what they decided was to take the power off the center of the crankshaft where that vibration would begin. There's a gear that goes up, and that powers the fan, the cooling fan for our 917, and runs some of the ancillaries. And then the other one goes down and powers the transmission. And because it's such a package, the clutch on a 917 is only 7 inches. They built the engine, it came out at 4.5 liters. The predictions were that hopefully it would make over 500 horsepower, which for a Porsche at that time was a moonshot. It ended up making 550 horsepower in the 4.5 liter form. They were onto something. They're like, okay, we've got the heart of the car now. Now we need the car. Up to that point, Porsche had built space frame chassis out of aluminum, and this was a very old technology. This is stuff from the 50s, but it was something that they knew, and they were building quickly. The cars, race cars now were transitioning into what were called monocoque, and that was aluminum panels built in boxes, and they would create the structure of the car. Then you just bolted things on the end of the boxes. They were lighter, they were stronger, they were the new technology, but Porsche at heart was a conservative company. It was an interesting juxtaposition because Ferry Porsche was from the old school and Ferdinand Piëch was from the new school, and they would butt up against each other all the time. You know, Ferdinand's wanted to build the latest, fastest stuff, and they kept each other in check. So they were like, we know this space frame. So they built it out of aluminum. They built the chassis out of different size tubes, depending on where there was load on it. So some of them were thicker, some of them were thinner, but they built the entire chassis as one air chamber. So they would drill into the tube, weld a tube on, then drill into the tube. And so the whole thing was one chamber. The reason for that was so that you could pressurize the frame, and if pressure was lost, you had a crack. In an aluminum frame, that was quite possible. The stories come that like they pressurized it with nitrogen and it made it lighter, and they put helium in there and all kinds of crazy. It's simple. It's just engineering. They just pressurized it. The mechanics would check it. It was a little Schrader valve on either side, and you just put your thing on there and like, oh, it's got pressure. It's not cracked. It was that simple. There was nothing mysterious about it. The other thing about the frame was that it had, and this is what they did with earlier cars, they would channel oil through the chassis. And the early 917s had a chamber that would move it through. Unfortunately, all that hot oil would turn the pedals and everything into a furnace and almost burn the drivers. But it was efficient, right? Their goal and Piëch's idea of a race car was not about the driver. This is way before driver safety and anybody gave a bit about the driver. The car was supposed to be as low drag as possible. They took it to a wind tunnel and they made a body for this amazing chassis. The chassis, when it was complete, 105, 104 pounds. You can just pick it up. I've picked up a 917 chassis. It's pretty cool. They made a fiberglass body for it that was bonded to the aluminum that made it even stronger. And the car, as we know, it was beautiful. But most people think of the Gulf car from the 70s. The original car in 1969, what they finished, it looked a lot more like the 908 Longtails. Again, it was about minimum drag. And anything that they wanted to add to it, NACA duct or a duct or add a hole in it to bring fresh air to the driver. Verboten. They wanted to keep it as smooth and fast as possible. What they ended up building was an undrivable car. They had built a car that is now moving into a realm that nobody had been before aerodynamically. So the top speed of a 908 Longtail at that time was like 185 miles an hour. And later on, the 908s would move up towards 200 miles an hour. The 917 was capable out of the box of over 220 miles an hour. And you got to remember that as you go up in speed, air becomes exponentially more dense and changes the way it moves over a car. They finish the car and they finish it. And this is amazing. And this was the time of going to the moon, right? We were building a machine that could get us on the moon. That kind of mentality was global. From the day they said, we're going to build a 917 to the day they had one, they had 25 of them lined up, was 10 months. 10 months to build a functional race car from scratch. And they were 2 days early, in fact, their goal. There was obviously some issues. It's a fresh race car. It came out, I believe it was March 1969 when it showed up at the Geneva Auto Show, when they first showed the first finished version of it. And people freaked out. It was like, what the heck is that? You might as well have brought a UFO. So the world saw this spaceship of a car. Ferrari saw something completely different. They saw a huge threat. And they didn't have a Group 5 sports car. So luckily, Ferrari had just sold their road-going division to Fiat, and they had the money to build a sports car. Now, what's a sports car? So a prototype is something that you build special. It's a special car. It can be one of one. A sports car, at that point, they were asking for 50 examples to be made. That would be lowered down to 25 eventually. But a sports car had to have a few things, a few elements to it. And these looked like prototypes. They were technically supposed to be road-going vehicles. So the 917 has a turnkey ignition. And if you see the key, they even drilled little holes in it to make it lighter. It's supposed to have a passenger seat because it's a two-seater. So they put a little vestibule, little seat in there next to the guy. It had to have a spare tire. So Porsche got together with, I believe, B.F. Goodrich to make one of the first Space Saver spares to slip into the back of the thing. My favorite part, it had to have room for luggage. So in the back of it, if you see the 917 tail up, there's 2 fiberglass trays in there. And that technically was put in for luggage capacity. It's not the tray where the mechanics put their tools, although it became that. That's where the luggage goes. It had to have tail lights and turn signals and all kinds of things. So they did all of that. We basically dressed the prototype up with sports car trappings. And a few people in the future did actually make their 917s road going after they were sold as old race cars. Ferrari's caught with their pants down, and they've started the creation of the 512. Porsche is months ahead. Porsche says, okay, it's time to get the cars going. Up to that point, homologation included building a certain amount of cars. And if you could prove that you had 18 cars being built or 7 cars of parts, they go, okay, you got the trappings of 25 cars. The FIA was like, we want to see 25 cars lined up on this date. And Porsche pulled it off. And the photograph, this is another weird myth. You'll see the photograph, and it's 25 917s all lined up. And you see the FIA inspectors kind of going, and the weird rumors were like, oh, they were just, bodies sitting on truck chassis and they cheated and all this. They built the cars. And you talk to the mechanics. They busted their ass. They actually finished 2 days before the FIA showed up. They did admit that one of them, the suspension pieces weren't correct. They just needed it on its wheels. But other than that, they put gas in all the cars and they're like, which one would you like to drive? So they just called the bluff and they pulled it off. So you got the car, it's homologated, let's go racing. That's a whole other story because the car did not drive well. They had put it in the wind tunnel in a miniature form, and they had done all the math in the world, but their goal was to build a low drag car that was going to win Le Mans. they had made other plans for the shorter tracks. In fact, most people don't know this. The original 917 had 2 tails that were available. It had a longer tail and a shorter tail. They thought about it. They were like, longer tail will be for the long circuits and the shorter tail for the shorter circuits, and had different wings on the back. But most of us have seen the weird, crazy shark-like long tail early 917s. And it was awful. People called it a widowmaker. There were stories of it going down, like testing it down the Mulsanne Strait, that the car would need the entire width of the Mulsanne Strait because it would just wander from one. If you can imagine this, like 200 miles an hour, the car is wandering from one side of the road to the other. And these guys with their balls of steel are like, yeah, it's a little disturbing. Like if you really disturb one of these guys, there is something insanely wrong with the car. And the Porsche drivers didn't want to drive it. And that's another one of the weird myths. They're like, well, they didn't want to drive it because it was a terrifying car. No, a race car driver wants to drive the best car for the race. And for most of those races at the time, the 908 was the best car. That car had reached its peak of development. It had gone through its growing stage. The 908 was a great car in 1969, and they would end up winning the first time the world championship with the 908. So the Porsche drivers drove that. They were trying to convince people and find drivers. If you come on out and, they called up Brian Redman, who wasn't a Porsche driver at the time, like, would you come out and drive one of the 917s for us? And Joe Sifford, like, would you maybe, could you possibly come out and test this for us? And it brought a lot of new drivers into the fold. The joke is that they couldn't find Porsche drivers, so they asked BMW drivers to do it. And they got people to come out and test them and drive them. They started racing them. And it went through its growing stages, but it wasn't a stable car. And now all of that, the rear end would kind of lift at speed. It would wander under braking. With that car's already unstable, and braking made it even worse. And the 917, they had developed some amazing brakes for it. It could outbrake the chassis. Like all the drivers talked about, like they couldn't use all the brakes because it would get unstable under braking. So it was an amazing package. It just didn't work. This should have been the greatest car ever. And it seemed to be like an abject failure. But it had potential, and they had invested so much in it. At this time, in 1968, John Ware won Le Mans again with a small engine GT40. And in 1969, he'd do it again. And Porsche's 908s were lined up to win Le Mans that year, and he still did it. So John Ware and his team were the team. At Sebring in 1969, they approached John Ware and said, we're thinking about having you run the Porsche team for 1970. And this is a really strange move when you think about it. There's a German company asking a British team with an American sponsor to run their car. And not everybody at Porsche was comfortable with this. But he could take these old cars and make them win. And he only had a couple of cars. He didn't have fleets of GT40s. He made the cars he had work and run and win. An excellent choice. And of course, he had seen the car at Geneva, and he was like, that's the future. Yes. So they finally came to an agreement. And John Ware gets his first chance to test the cars in late 1969. Now, this is only months before the first time it shows up at a race in the 1970 season at Daytona. And it wins. This is its first win at the last race of the year in Austria. It wins. And I mean, by the skin of its teeth, it wins. And even the drivers were like, I don't even know how we did that. They pulled it off. So they had all the data from that track, from that last run. So very smartly, they stayed there with a couple of 917s, and they brought in the 917 PA, which was a car they built for Can-Am in the United States. And it was a kind of open top car. It looked more like a 908 Spider. And I think that's actually part of the body that they started using on it. But it was a 917 underneath. And the drivers liked driving that. So they drove it around the track, and they said, okay, what's good about this? They said, and this is the Porsche team along next to John Ware, kind of the handing off of what was going on. Now, what happened at that track over those few days is what made the 917 we remember it. They were driving it, wasn't stable, they couldn't figure it out. They thought there was chassis flex. Everybody was guessing. They kept messing with the suspension. They're like, the chassis is doing something. And they're like, but the Can-Am car is fine. Like, what's the deal? There's a thing called observational engineering. It doesn't really exist today with computers and everything, but you can sit there and engineer something by looking at it and breaking it down in your head. And John Horseman, who is Ware's right-hand man, the story goes is that the car came in and it was later in the day and there were bugs. Obviously, we all have driven through bugs with our cars and smashes on the windshield, and it's inevitable, especially at those speeds. And there were gnats all over the front of the car. And as you went farther back, there were less gnats until there were none. And at the top of the rear spoiler, there were just a couple of gnats. So the conclusion was there wasn't any air hitting the back of the car. That it was just blowing off the car and had no downforce at the rear. And Porsche was already after this. Porsche were the ones who kind of were like, they knew something was wrong. They brought, and this is so 24 Hours of Lemons, I love it. They brought sheets of aluminum, duct tape, and self-tapping screws. And they were going to figure out what was wrong. And right there, they're like, we got to do something about this rear end. We got to raise the rear end and get into the airflow, which was very similar to the Can-Am version of it. So they cut the rear end of this car off. Now, the 917 at that point had all these crazy flappy wings all over it to try to keep it stable. They're really cool, actually. The wings on the front and there's wings on the back, and they're connected to the suspension. So when the suspension lifts, the wings are supposed to get up and push the car back down, and they go back to zero drag. So they just hack all this stuff off. I mean, you can imagine them as Sawzall. They were literally taking the sheets of aluminum on the Armco barrier and shaping them out there at the racetrack. They build this hideous looking wedge and stick it on the back of the car. And they send out Brian Redman and they're like, go drive the car. And he goes around and he comes in. He's 3 seconds a lap faster. And he's like, this is a race car. Like that moment, that Baji transformation, right? No, just hammering stuff out of aluminum. The car was 3 seconds a lap faster. A couple more adjustments, 4 seconds a lap faster. When they were done, it was 5 seconds a lap faster. You would have had to put another 50, 60 horsepower in the engine to accomplish that, just out of changing the body style. So what was born out of that was what's called the 917K, or Kurtz, or Kurtzek, short tail. And the short tail is the car that most of us know. It's the Gulf car that we see. They bring the car to Daytona, and Daytona is the opening race. This is what's going to prove that everything's worked out, that this weird relationship between a British and American and the Germans and the car and the changes all going to work. So they rent Daytona, and they banish all the Daytona employees. They don't want anybody to see what they're doing. And they run Daytona. They run like 26 hours in there to get the car ready. And they discover one of the problems with Daytona is that when you're in the banking, it's just 31 degrees, you're looking into the banking as you're going around it. They couldn't see out of it. So Daytona cars have another window above the main front window. And that was for you looking out and being able to see in front of you. And they made a few other developments because Daytona is a very different type of race. It destroys suspensions. It's really rough. And they got the car ready. It shows up at Daytona, and there's 2 of them. What had happened in the meantime is, remember I said that Porsche wasn't completely, that some of the Porsche family wasn't completely into this whole British team thing. They created another team called Porsche Salzburg, or Porsche Austria, which was supposed to be a privateer team owned by the Piech family. And there's another 917 on the grid, the 2 Gulf Ware cars and Porsche Salzburg. And they're like, oh, okay. All right, we'll see how that works out. And 1970 Daytona was the beginning of what would be 2 years of utter domination. They would come in first and second at Daytona, setting records as they went. They would win Le Mans for the first time. And they had started developing another long-tail version, higher up, called the Langheck, the long-tail. So the long-tail, that was going to be the car that was going to win. And it was actually a Salzburg car, won Le Mans that year. Then they win next year. They do Daytona again. They do Sebring, and they do Le Mans. And the rules change. That the 917 is no longer a viable sports car. They knew that which I thought was interesting. They knew that in 1968. They knew going in that this car would only last 3 years. And yet they did it anyway. And it became an unbeatable icon with some of the greatest liveries of all time. The hippie livery, the Gulf, the Salzburg liveries, just stunning cars. But they didn't stop there. Just so you know, the 917 lived on for a few more years when it went to Can-Am in the United States and ended up ruling there as well. The 917 was and is the unstoppable race car.
So those have been our top 10 car stories of 2022. Thank you so much for watching, and now it's time to ring in the new year. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! I hope that you had an amazing 2022, and I hope that 2023 is even better. Happy New Year from all of us here at VinWiki and CarTrek, and from our families to yours. Have a great 2023.